I'm going to talk today on the subject of the three-part soul and the need for asceticism. That is the title. So I think these are things that are coming particularly from my background. I know Zach from St. Paul's Greek Orthodox Church. So this is from a little bit of, that definitely informs how I talk about these things. But we're going to just try to understand what all this means from like a ground level and try to understand how it relates to our lives, everyone's life. And I think, again, I wasn't here for the previous presentations about logic and things. I don't know if I'm that smart enough to talk about many of those things. But I'm bringing what I've experienced and what I've seen and what I think is very helpful for humans. So hopefully it's helpful. If not, just let me know and I'll try to do better. Anyway, sounds good. So that's the idea. So when we're starting with this, the first thing that usually comes to people is like, what do you mean by soul? At least that's what I think of when I was growing up. So soul, what is it? So at least from what I can figure from like just being around, modern Western culture, is people start thinking about soul, they're like, oh, there's like some disembodied thing in the body somewhere. It's like, is that a soul? And then maybe, is this soul even immortal? Maybe if you're an atheist, you're like, what do you mean immortal soul? Maybe if you're some particular religious traditions, you're like, oh, there is an immortal soul. So that's often the discussion about soul. But then interestingly enough, you see other things, like Aretha Franklin, soul sister, and they're singing soul music. And and that becomes a common way to talk about this form of black, African-American expression. You have other albums, soul, what is it? It's even asking our question over here, what is the soul? I don't know. And from all these even black artists, you then get a movie, Soul, which is both touching on all the other points earlier, both in the music and also this idea of this something about us that maybe goes on after we die or something. So there's that idea of soul there. And with all that all black culture, you also have soul food on top of all this. You have soul food that people are eating, right? And along the lines of eating, you also have chicken soup for the soul. And stories that open the heart and rekindle the spirit. And so it's somewhere in between all those things. And even modern books like the soulmate equation. You have relational things. So from all this word sounds pretty odd and complex and non-intuitive, right? At least to me it seems like it. So I feel like for most of my life I didn't really understand what to think of when I heard the word soul. So in the last maybe even few months I've kind of learned more. And so here's some of what my reflections, what I found recently. So the English word soul historically refers to the ancient Greek word psyche. That's how you pronounce it. It looks like psyche, but it's actually psyche is actually how you pronounce it in modern Greek. And so this, it says in ancient Greek, so these people, this is from Raphael's painting of the Greek philosophers, all these people, they are the ones that led to a lot of the pre- and post-Socrates philosophy that later, the Enlightenment philosophers and other people were kind of recapturing and, through translations, through Arabic and stuff. But it's them that really started using this word to talk about some of these concepts. And what do they mean when they talked about it? Well, at a high level, psyche refers to the animating principle of a living human or animal body. What do you mean by that? An animating principle. What does that mean? Essentially, psyche refers to is the thing that most obviously distinguish a living human from a dead corpse. And that is what psyche is. That's what soul means. So at the very highest level, that's what it meant originally. Particularly before Plato and Socrates, that's really what it meant. And it still meant that later on, but people would then start to define what exactly is it that distinguishes a living human from a dead corpse. So that's the idea there, the idea of a dead corpse versus a living soul. Now, as I mentioned, this word began to evolve, and particularly was when written down from Plato. So in the Republic, and in some other works that Plato did, he pioneered the idea that the psyche, that the soul, is composed of three parts. What are those three parts, you might ask? Well, in Greek, this was logistikon, themothes, and epithematikon. So those would be the Greek ones. You're like, well, you can kind of guess a little bit. We got something over here. That is logic, right? So the idea of logic. Emotions and desires are these kind of three categories that we had. He also, saw the soul as being something that is actually intimately attached to the body, that is infused throughout the body. And so he particularly, these centers of logic, emotion, and desires, he attached to being part of the head, the chest, and the gut, or the stomach. And so even more specifically as modern terminology, that gets tied to the idea of the mind, the heart, and the will. And so these ideas, the mind being the center of logic, the heart being the center of emotions, and the will being the center of desires, that is what Plato meant when he said the soul, psyche. So he's talking about that whole interconnected system. Okay. So, and for centuries, really, this Plato's model and understanding of the soul was really the dominant way of how people understood what the soul was and what distinguishes living humans, and understanding it as something that it's in three parts. So really from the 370s BC, when Plato published the Republic and a few other things, it was the dominant mode for discussing what the soul is. And hence, by much later, by the 1500s AD, so a little past the late Middle Ages, early part of the early modern era. At that point, Renaissance humanists, who had kind of recovered a lot of the Greek tradition in translation, when they wanted to discuss how to balance the perfect ecosystem of the mind, the will, and the heart, how to perfect it and balance it, they coined the term psychology from psyche. Same kind of root word here, which really, literally at the time meant the study of the soul, the mind, the will, and the heart. The full study. That is originally what psychology meant. And so this idea, even on this book that you have here, it says at the top there, psychologia, which is the humanist of the human, perfecting the human essentially through psychology. And that was the idea of the study of the soul and study of perfection, which is very much in line with how Plato thought about things. However, within a few hundred years, there's a transition that happens in the West, because by the 1700s AD or so, at that point, Enlightenment philosophers placed a greater and greater emphasis on logic, reason, and rational thought, and so they began to use the term psychology to refer much more narrowly to the study of the mind, not really the heart and will, just the mind, and that was kind of in keeping of this very highly logical way of looking at the world. And so that has a lot of ramifications about how humans understand ourselves, each other, and how we act and behave, I think Plato would think. And that is for a couple things. So one, I won't go into everything about the Enlightenment. It's too much of a big topic to go into all of it. But what I will say is that from the perspective of many commentators later on, even just 100 years later, but even more now, the 18th century Enlightenment, while being very beneficial in many ways to modern society, it shifted Western culture towards an imbalanced state of being, in which the culture kind of overemphasized reasonings of the mind while neglecting the heart and the will. And that's a little bit of what I think Zach was mentioning earlier. So that idea is, you start seeing that really with the Enlightenment. And there was certain people who really didn't agree with this. And so in the 19th century, really following after that, there was another philosophical movement called Romanticism. Really started in Germany and influenced a lot of things elsewhere. And so it shifted, and it was almost a reaction against the Enlightenment in many ways, very specifically and generally too as well. And it shifted Western culture towards this imbalanced state in which overemphasized the emotions of the heart while neglecting the mind and the will. So you see this kind of pendulum swing back and forth in the culture, that not something that is integrated, but swinging from one thing to the other. And so in ways you can think about it, we have our technology and our shipping and our phones, internet through Enlightenment, Western rational thought. But then when people have relationships and they watch movies and they listen to Taylor Swift, or they watch football, then they are in this sense of emotion and romanticism, and they switch back and forth, but it's not necessarily integrated. And so this leads to this kind of imbalanced, state, where in many ways it is very, there's a great talk by a guy named Isaiah Berlin that goes through Romanticism as a reaction to Enlightenment. I don't have time to go into it, but one of the things he argues and sets out well is that pretty much every single philosophical and social movement that happened in the 20th century can essentially be traced by some combination of Enlightenment and Romanticism. It's like one or the other, and mixing those together. But not necessarily integrated them. And so this leads to a lot of this back and forth and these long-term states of imbalance for a lot of both Western individuals and society. And that's, I think, critical for a couple reasons. This idea of this imbalance you can see this in both the body and in the soul. So what happens if the muscular powers of the body become imbalanced? Well, what naturally happens, if you just look it up, is that the posture of the body becomes crooked. And when the posture is crooked, someone cannot walk physically upright when there is an imbalance in the body. And in much the same way, when the psychological powers of the soul, when the brain, the heart, the gut, when they become imbalanced, the posture of the soul also tends to be crooked, and it can't live in a way that is morally upright. And that's like a big idea that is a very ancient idea as well too. And we see this, and more recently in empirical evidence, which is that if you look at the literature from like the DSM, like the Statistical Manual for Diagnosing Mental Health, imbalances between reason and emotions on an individual level is one of the hallmarks and leading factors for the diagnosis of many various mental illnesses. Not being able, whether that is an unregulated emotions where the reason isn't able to regulate the emotions, or a loss of emotions where the reason rules everything and one person can't decide because they don't have emotional strength as well too. It leads to all of these states that leads to various forms of mental illness. And in much the same way, an imbalance between reason and emotions on the level of a culture also leads to societal ills, which manifests in many forms of social injustice. And even this, as you can see, is even if you look at the current political standpoint and where you see people on different sides of political parties and things, you can if you really reflect on this, you see where people are switching and going from, some people are very focused on the mind or on the logic and the reason, other people on the heart and the feeling, their bleeding heart and how they feel about things. And it's very hard to talk and find a balance. And it's very hard to create justice at a societal level because of that. And so that's something that we can see with modern commentary, but also it's something that is an ancient understanding as well too. And that is because going back to the Republic, which I mentioned earlier, Plato specifically addresses this issue of the disordered imbalance within the soul. Okay? And what Plato concluded is that justice only comes from self-mastery and discipline, which ties all three parts of the soul together in harmony. And he compares this like three notes that form a chord in music. And it's only when you have that harmony that you actually can have justice. That's kind of his idea. Which you can see in this quote over here. I'll kind of summarize it a little bit, but point out the pieces. So this is again from the Republic. And he talks about this idea that in reality justice, which we often think about only the societal level, what he says is it is not a matter of external behavior, what you do on the outside or what other people are doing in society, but it's actually a matter of the internal self. Okay? The just man, the one who is justice, does not allow the several elements of his soul to usurp one another's functions. Again, the mind, the will, and the heart. They don't override each other. He is the one who sets his house in order, the house being a metaphor for his soul. His whole soul is the house. He sets it in order by self-mastery and discipline, and he comes to peace with himself. And he brings into tune those three parts, like a musical chord. Okay? He makes them into a unit instead of a plurality, and is self-controlled, and it's in harmony, because they're all three together. And because of that, he's able to identify, to name the things that are just and what are good at fine actions. And he's also able to recognize and name the things that are unjust actions. And that only happens when he has this harmony in the soul. Okay, that was Plato's idea. On a very similar thread, he talked about this idea that he also included that virtue, right? Virtue, which is an essential part of the good behaviors that lead to good things and that lead to justice ultimately, that for there to be virtue and to be able to act with justice, that only comes from a soul that has become healthy through discipline and order. So we have this idea of harmony, of music and beauty, and we have this idea of health, of this this therapeutic sense of like the soul. And discipline is a way to understand it in both ways. So this is also sections from the Republic, where he talks about to produce health is to establish the parts of the body in relation to mastering and being mastered by one another, that is according to nature. So what he's saying there is the idea that while the parts of the body of the soul don't rule over each other, they have a role Like, the mind has logical reasoning to understand what's going on in the world, but the heart still has this idea of being able to feel, to understand what's actually important. And one doesn't operate and dominate over the other. They have this ordering of it, and it's when it happens in a natural way that you then come to health. And what is sickness is whenever there is some kind of ruling in the soul that is actually not what is according to nature, as humans are designed to be able to lead to a proper balance between their mind, their will, and their heart. And so virtue is, again, the health, the beauty, the condition of the soul, while vice is the sickness, the ugliness, and the weakness of the soul. I'll pause there for a little bit. How y'all doing? Does this make sense at all, people? Any questions?
But it sounds like the proximate cause of health has to be the will, because that only through the will do you have self-discipline.
Good question. So will is definitely one factor, but I think I would resist saying that it's only one thing. Because you can have a strong will, but your will can, usually in its natural state, isn't going to necessarily will the good things. We don't come into the world willing everything good. We come into the world willing to have pleasure and avoid pain. And even the most basic things, if you knowing what it means to have discipline, I have kids, and I discipline the kids, and their will surely does not bend towards me disciplining them, even though I know it's good for them. Right. Their will bends this total different direction. I deal with this all the time with my son, because he has a will where he wants to do something. And the most upset he ever gets is when I just come and tell him, actually, I want you to not do that, I want you to do this thing or his homework. He gets so upset from it, because his will is misaligned with what I want him to do. And so what I would say to that is, how do you learn to have the will? Well, you also need the mind and the heart for the will to be aware of where it should be inclined to. So, and that's what Plato says, and I think that's his overall thing, that you need all three. You don't need one. Doesn't come to one. And in some people, I would argue, in some cases, one might be stronger than others. So some people come, maybe if you go and meet everybody in the gym, they probably have a stronger will than most other people, and that might be dominating for them. But if you go to the Enlightenment philosophers, maybe some of this conversation you might have had previously on logic, you might have a whole bunch of people that are very dominant in the head, right? And if you go to a Black Lives Matter protest or something, or if you go to a generally left-leaning thing, you're going to have a lot of heart. You're going to have a lot of leaning of the heart, and maybe not really focus on the will and not focus on the mind as much.
That's an interesting way of putting it, but go for it.
Yeah, I'm curious, what do you think? Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about that earlier, about the mind and the heart and where it lands in terms of political persuasions. And because when you talk about the mind, I'm a very mind-centric person, but I'm also very, I concern myself with the well-being of human beings. So it's not like it's just either or. It's to me, I have both of those inclinations. So to imply that the people on the left are just going with their heart, I think that maybe is perhaps a little oversimplification.
What I would say is, I'm not saying that any one person just goes with it. What I'm saying is certain people lean into one versus the other. And what I would say to that is, if you look at the appeals of anything that people make, when someone is trying to appeal to someone, what do they lean into? Right? What I would say, and I say this, I brought this example partially because I'm black, so I feel like I can bring this up. That's why I felt like So what I can say, as someone who grew up reading the autobiography of Malcolm X and listened to lots of hip hop, I can speak to this experience a lot. And what I will say is that part of my life and that part of my own soul that I understand kind of in certain ways now is that when you look back at, this is how my ancestors were treated, this is what happened. What I'm appealing to you is not necessarily this is the exact way to make a perfect society. That's not what I'm appealing to. What I'm appealing to is look at my pain. And look at the pain that the other people have. And I want you to feel empathy. I want you to feel sadness for this. I want you to feel my sadness for you. I'm trying to appeal to you based on my heart. Right? And I might use logical things like, look at this happen. I might point this thing about America or this thing about this happen. And I might use logic to kind of support my point. But ultimately, what I'm really appealing to you is I want you to see my pain. At least that's my experience of being in those communities. being part of it. I don't know, maybe it's different for you, but that's my experience of it.
Okay, well, maybe we can go deeper into that later.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I had a question that's kind of like a prerequisite for this, which is I think when the soul gets brought up, especially in the context and probably in this group, I think the first thing that people comes to mind is just like whether the soul exists, like materialism debates. But I'm interested, just given these first few slides you talked about, do you feel like the points that you're trying to make here rest at all on whether or not you believe the soul to be this like immaterial thing that exists in a way that like maybe a lot of religious people would, whereas like kind of modern, more like materialist, naturalists could probably listen to all of this and agree with everything you're saying and just think of it as part of like psychology and understanding the brain. So like, do you feel like the points you're making depend on whether someone believes the soul to be material or immaterial?
I do not think that any of the points that I'm making have anything to do with whether you believe it's material or immaterial. I just think this is like a factor way to understand human existence. I think that is originally, I think, what, if you look at the Greek philosophy, I think that's how they thought of it. Now, there might be different ways of people understand and have different narratives of what that might exist in depth, but I don't think that's inherent to the definition.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's inherent to this understanding of the soul, or as we're going to talk about, the suggestions of what to do and how to understand oneself and how to respond to this understanding of the soul. So yeah, I don't think it really depends at all on believing in an immortal soul. Yeah, which I think is also why I tend to go back to Plato, because I think most people don't. Even though they have a certain sense of religion within ancient Greek, we don't think about it the same that we think about maybe modern forms of religion. I think that's why it's good to look back at the origins of where it comes from, because I think it's something where you can understand from any particular philosophical or spiritual or non-spiritual tradition. Any other questions? Sounds good. So, then that leads to this question. What can a person do for their soul to become disciplined, harmonious, ordered, balanced, and healthy? Yeah, thoughts? What can we do?
Smell the roses. Smell the daisies.
Yeah.
Yeah, jumping off of that, because I think that's quite similar to what I was going to say. So great, nice sequence. I think first, like, take a moment to self-reflect on, which component is out of balance, right? If it's a chain, like, what is the weak link in the chain that is causing the disruption? Because then, if nothing else, you at least know where to focus your efforts first.
Yeah, makes sense. So you lead with the mind there. You use some like logic to try to be able to reflect on it, but then find the balance, right?
Well, I understand why you go there, but I don't think so, because I think it takes all three. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, you have to think about it, but you also have to feel, right? And if you can't, maybe therein lies the answer that is the problem, and thinking more for myself, actually, like thinking about will and how it related to the gut, and I'm like, man, when I'm not eating well, my brain isn't working right, like I'm not feeling good just in general and emotionally and all that stuff. So like I think you have to address sort of each one, and then it will be apparent. Like, my mind is working okay, I feel good, but like my emotions are out of whack. Okay, so then therein lies the
That makes sense.
where my focus.
Yeah. Even when I said that, I wasn't necessarily saying that's a bad solution. What I'm saying is that it's kind of, sometimes you have to kind of, there's like one thing and one part of the soul can help us to understand and be aware of it. And then as you acknowledge the fact that like there might be some other changes or things around with that. But sometimes, often, particularly when there's a balance, there might be one that's maybe more able to be able to start making a change. Right? So I'm just observing that as I'm hearing you talk about it. Any other thoughts?
I don't know if this is a good place to interject this, but I was just thinking about like, so if somebody is ill, maybe they are old and their body's breaking down, or they have some kind of problem where I'm thinking they're really not able at that point in time to be a disciplined person.
Yeah.
How does that play into this whole idea?
How does that play into it? If someone is old, or if they have some other pre-existing condition or other thing, and that because that they have, you seem to be saying like a physical kind of ailment, like age, other things like that, some brain, maybe some like hormonal issue or something like that. How does that play into it? It's a good question. I think, well, what I would say is like, if one new effect is that it means that they might be in a state of illness, right? I think one of the larger ideas of many non-Western or at least pre-modern Western ideas is that the soul and the body are like intimately connected with each other, right? And so we shouldn't find it surprising that there could be things that affect the body that then lead to affecting the soul, or things that affect the soul that can lead to affecting the body. Whether that be the way that you eat, that, you know, you have diabetes and then you can't regulate your emotions. There's the body affecting the soul. But you also could be in a place where one is like feeling a lot of anxiety and that changes your heart rate. So the body and the soul, they're tied together, right? And so there's this idea in kind of the ancient world that the body and the soul, you have to have a holistic picture. And there's the idea that any bringing to health is actually going to involve both the body and the soul. Right? And it takes wisdom and it takes certain traditions of seeing that to be able to figure out what is the right thing to do. Because whatever it may be, if someone's older, it depends on what it is. Some things that might have been, well, so there's something you could do with your body at early stages of life to do. There's some things you can do with your body now. There's certain things you can do with your mind or your heart now. It just kind of depends. And I think, but there's the idea that understanding it as a whole, that there's a myriad of things that one can go towards for a good sense of health.
I guess what I'm saying is that it almost sounds like there's a judgment that somebody who is ill is not disciplined. I don't know if I'm understanding that correctly, and that to get back into health would require that you have the discipline to, you know, use the mind and the rationality and the will.
Good question. I was kind of thinking, you didn't say it outright, but I was kind of thinking that might be your hang up on it. But yeah, so this idea of judgment. So I don't think that that's the point, right? I would say if you go to the doctor and you have high blood pressure, I think you need to go and find out you have high blood pressure. I don't think that that's a judgment necessarily as much as it is to be as assessing the current state of your existence or of your body's existence at the very least. And then it's really beyond that one can determine what to do, but one has to know at least first. And there's a certain way in which things can be measured, maybe in a certain way, of like this is the measurement of where things are right now. And that it takes, then it's up to that. Now, of course, someone can use that, just like people can use physical things now. Setting the soul aside, one could look at things of someone being obese or addicted to drugs, and that doesn't really start with things that are related. That mostly the body, not. And that could lead to certain things, and you could look at that empathetically and look at that as, oh, there's things that we can maybe do to like get a better state. Or you can look at that being like, wow, no one should ever bring that up because that's judgment. And what I would say is I have a lot of empathy for that because that is often people's experiences. Maybe they grew up and they were made fun of, maybe things going on. And so there is that sense of like people feeling judgment. So I do understand that. But I think what I would say at the same time is that I don't think we can close our eyes to the reality of where and get to health. And ultimately, in this finite life, our bodies all break down anyway. Right? And so there is a sense of like everything that we have in our body will slowly decay. But that doesn't make us less valuable and you know worthy of existence or life. At least that's what I think.
I'll add something too. Just a thought as we're thinking about this. Like part of why there is no judgment is, and I think you just touched on it. Like with things like certain things that affect the body, it's not just about your internal order. It's about the world we live in that's also disordered. The societal things you're talking about that can affect someone. So it wouldn't be so simple to say someone's experiencing something bodily and to say, well, internally, there must be something you're not doing. It's like, well, you exist in a world that's also societally unjust, disordered in certain ways that impacts your own health.
Yeah, I think that was what we were kind of getting at here a little bit earlier, this idea of the individual and like the societal level. I think that's a really good addition and a good point. Is that society affects us. I think often I grew up listening to a lot of music or just in a sort of culture where it's like, oh, I do what I do. I'm just doing me. I'm just doing things there's the idea that it's myself and I like the things that I like. And when I got older and I studied like economics and like when I like behavioral change management and design, I got older and looked back and was like, wait, it wasn't just me. Like there's a whole system of things that is getting me to buy this, to be advertised to this, to get me to use social media. I'm not really making this. It's not from me. And when I got older and I went to college and I met people that had come to the same music and song and things, like, oh wait, you actually were like advertising the same way and got it the same way. It's not necessarily because it was just me. It's just the fact of like we lived in this general environment. We're exposed to similar things. And I think that is there. And I think one of the things about that, and what also might lead to a little bit of judgment, is that I do think that in the modern West, we've moved from a more collective society more to like an individual society. So, and even in America, it's even more so of like, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? There's a sense of like everything comes down to like individual. Like it's like whether you succeed or not, it's on you, whether things are there. And that can be a place where there's not as much empathy, I think, and understanding. And so I think, what I see, at least in the Black community, what I was referencing earlier, is that you have the sense of one of the big debates is like, well, we're coming from this place where look at what's happened in history, and we are coming from a place where we had families together, or that aren't unaffected by the war on drugs or other things like that, and that has affected us to this day, either in our genes or the society that we grew up, the communities that we're part of. And that is affecting the choices that I had in life. And that's why Jay-Z would say, like, I got into selling drugs because I didn't have any other options. It was that or just like starve. So as Zach was saying, is like I think part of that is recognizing maybe more societal level of what's going on here, that each individual affects others and affects society, and society affects each other. And so I think as a broader theme we keep getting into, is things are interconnected. The individual is connected to society. The soul is connected to the body. In the body, the mind, the will, and the heart are all connected. You can't separate them.
Right.
As much as a lot of particularly Enlightenment thought really tries to separate everything and put everything in boxes. And that can be helpful to be able to understand something. But invariably, and I think you're from China, so you realize that in China, that's not really how it is historically in China. I don't imagine at all. That's like a very foreign idea. If you look at Chinese medicine, you look at it, it's not separated. Not at all, right? So it's not and it's a modern society, but they still do not separate it like that, right? And so there are certain ways that we understand it. That's the way that, even the way that most of y'all understand, is influenced by these hundreds of years of society, that you understand this way. The way she understands it, through no choice of her own, is different. Not necessarily because of her, but because of this society that was passed on. And so I'm always trying to get people to understand, hey, you didn't just come to your political persuasions. You didn't just come to this yourself. There is a whole set of things that now you do have a certain temperament. You do have certain things that might be more likely to put you in one way versus the other. So there's a range that one can go to. One can grow up in China and have something like that happen and be like, I totally reject this, and now I'm going to be purely rational. That can happen. And you have the other way. If somebody starts off and be like, I am now going to become a Zen Buddhist because I had this experience. That happens at the fringes. But generally speaking, we're all influenced by this larger set of connected things. And so I don't think there's any room for judgment because it's not all on us. And I think it's only when you have a very individualistic way of looking at things that would even be the case.
When you write your imbalance between reason and emotions, right? So how do you quantify that? Is it just, is there a way to quantify it? Reason is high, emotions are low, or how do you quantify that, or is it just each one decides for himself?
That's probably beyond the scope of this, but so this is, like I said, I think if you want to do some research, look up the DSM, that Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It is a science research based way to assess mental health diagnoses. And so whatever thing, whether it be bipolar or borderline personality disorder or narcissistic disorder, if you're trying autism, whatever it is, there are certain ways that have over time developed how to assess these things about people's minds or their emotions or their rationality. And these are legitimate ways that even in the modern West they understand things. That there are certain ways of having an imbalance.
But these things you described,
Mm-hmm.
they're is it because somebody chooses? It's not because somebody chooses to be rational and suppress their emotions. It's I think a lot of people might be born that way, right?
Yeah, totally.
It might be a chemical imbalance, or
Yeah.
so. How do you? But what I'm saying is, when you think I have time understanding is when people talk about like imbalance between reason and emotions. So you have the scale there going up and down.
Yep.
So you're saying, okay, here is somebody who reasons a lot and maybe has less emotions. Or so how do you how? So
Measure it?
yeah, how do you measure? Or is it just each one decides? Oh, I think it's like this. Is there a
Generally-
quantitative way?
Yeah, like I said, it's beyond their scope, and particularly
Because
because
like what you described, those
Yeah.
are diseases probably. So I don't know if they fall in the same category or not. You know, the bipolar. Sorry, you know, you can take. It might be a lack of lithium, so you take lithium and prescribe the lithium, and that changes the balance of chemicals in their brains, and it's they say, oh, most people they have this is the balance of chemicals in your brain, and this person it's off, so let's give some chemicals and like try to make the balance in this person the same as most people, and hopefully that so that person behaves like most people.
yeah.
Right, but again, that doesn't. To me, I don't understand when you say. There's one thing which you call reason. There's one thing which you call emotion, and how do you equate them, or how do you? I don't know if there's a way to do that, or.
Yeah, so like so the DSM is there. Generally speaking, it depends on the thing. And example I will give you is let's say someone is I'm not going to be judgmental. So I'm trying to think of something an example. Let's say someone gets upset from something. Maybe someone cut them off when they were driving or something. That's not stick to any identity. There is a certain average of how long somebody will be upset about that. And it's a range. Some people might not think about it at all. Yeah. Some people, it might bother them like the rest of like the week or something like that, or at least the rest of the day. And there might be somebody that can just literally go back to that moment, and it's 10 years later, and they're still living in it. That person would be very much outside of the range of what would be considered healthy and within the range of normal. And if someone is in that standpoint, man, their mind must be flooded because all the things that must have happened in their life that they're still living in would be very difficult to deal with. And there are people for who that exists. And again, that's the real, like, for that particular example, is an extreme example of what that exists. But it's more common that, maybe it's something else. Maybe their parents went through a divorce. Maybe it's a traumatic thing that happened. Maybe they were called a name in school. And sometimes for people, that's something they hold on to for 25 years. And for some people, it's kind of like, oh, it happened. And like, I realized at the end of the day, like they were kind of immature and that's why they did it. And for some reason, they could be able to reason through that. But some people, like the way they feel about it, it brings them back for years and years and years. Right. And that is just a reality of a human experience. And so what I'm saying is like, these are little vignettes of it. But what I'm saying is like, there's clear times where some of it is like, that's beyond the scope of what's considered like healthy or normal. And so what something like DSM is trying to do is help you to see some of the boundaries of like, this is actually far outside. This is a couple standard deviations outside of what's normal. And because of that, it's probably going to affect them in certain ways where it's going to be hard for them to have a fulfilling and healthy life, to have healthy relationships, to be productive in society, to be able to, like, that's just going to be difficult if you're remembering the person could have cut you off 20 years ago. And that's a reality. And so one can debate, and even in DSM itself, they're changing a lot of it where they're trying to make certain things where it's not like these categories and all of a sudden you have a disease and then like one goes away and then you suddenly don't have the disease. They're trying to change it now to where they're doing it as more of kind of a range-based kind of thing. So we get all over that. Like, and that's not even my main profession, but that's just the stuff I know about it. So it gets, but it's what I say is it's there. If you go and research it, there are things, and it's and if you just listen to it, the explanation, it makes sense. There is some range at which something is unhealthy, clearly unhealthy.
It does get at an interesting thing though about how our assessment of mental health is like an institutional practice, like does rely on these sort of averages. Like we look at what the average human is like in terms of their personality, and so in some sense that would be blind to like an ailment we all have, where presumably a few rare set of humans could figure out how to control or build habits or whatever to attain a level of happiness that's rare, but that requires a statistically unusual personality, which would be hard to measure, kind of by definition.
Wow, you're so wise. Thank you. That is great. I love that observation.
Well, because I know it's one of the issues with the DSM is like, we have history of cases where, human conditions that we no longer see as a problem
Yeah.
were for a while seen as abnormal because they were statistically abnormal, but now we would see it as, oh, well, the issue with society was just discriminatory towards people's life choices. And so I think that's like the case where, we have to inevitably use sort of statistical deviance to figure out what's normal for humans, but obviously that's sort of an imperfect measurement that we rely on.
Sorry, can I ask you to repeat what you said while I was grabbing a bottle of water?
Just that things like the DSM, in order to determine what might be an imbalance of the human, we have to rely on looking at the average person's behavior. So what is like a normal level of like talking to yourself?
Yeah.
You know, like we just look at humans, how often do they talk to themselves, and when it's way more than the average person, we assume that's an unhealthy deviation. So then my point was just that sort of rules out the possibility of like healthy deviations where someone is like above, out of some normal range, but actually in a way that's good. Just that metric alone won't get you to that. But
Well, I think the DSM, aren't they on like DSM 5 now?
Yeah, DSM 5 is one that's currently being
So
used.
they're constantly updating it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
nothing against the DSM.
Nothing, but I'm not defending it at all. I don't think you are either. It's more of like I brought it up to say like, hey, like this is how modern psychology tries. This is its best attempt to try to understand things that are very complex, and people have been. And I think the very fact of like, even though that's a standard science, and we all can like talk about here's where it's flawed, and like here's why it's gone through things. It shows that it's a very ancient problem, and it's a very difficult one. And it's one that takes a lot of wisdom and discernment. It doesn't necessarily fit on all of our statistical categories.
Well, it really kind of even doesn't get at the question you're asking before. Like the DSM isn't concerned with like practices that make you healthy. It's more about identifying abnormalities that make people not live well in society.
Yeah, makes sense.
So it still leaves that open.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What does balance mean when your mind, heart, and gut agrees? Because I was looking at this quote, and I guess it's supposed to be contradicting, but it's supposed to be compatible.
Yeah, it's a good question.
When all three, for one thing, to where all three agrees, is that balance when it all agrees, or is balance where you're able to have the three of them disagree?
It's a good question. I think the three things are doing different things, and so you have to understand what they're doing. I guess the way my short story is, what is the mind doing? The mind is like looking at cause and effect relationships, right? It's saying, oh, if this gets dropped, it goes down because of gravity. And you see that all the time as a kid, and you observe these cause and effect relationships. So that's often what the mind, often what reason and logic is doing, is trying to understand the world as like, if this happened, then this will happen. If this happens, then this will happen. If I do this, this will happen. If I take this drug, this will happen. If this falls, like, that is what logic is. And so that's often what it's doing, is it's assigning cause and effect relationships. I don't think that the heart is necessarily trying to do that. The mind is trying to do that. So to some extent, disagreeing is like, it's more so that it's doing a different thing. While the heart is, and what are emotions for? Emotions really are about labeling certain things as being important or not. When you are fearful, what is a fear doing? Like they do these studies where like when someone's afraid and they can't remember the face of the person that was pointing a gun at them. Why is that? Because their brain, their fear was getting them to focus on the gun, not the face of the person. And so when what emotions do in humans and animals is that if we had to logic through everything, oh, if I do this, if I do this, if I do this, it doesn't work that quickly. We have to do a whole calculation of like, if I jump out of the way, will the bullet hit me? Like that is too long to even do it. So what emotions do is they quickly drive us to actions by first identifying things that we should pay attention to, and thus motivate us to take actions. So that's really what it's doing. It's not trying to assess necessarily, like, it's not really necessarily trying to assess the cause and effect. It's just saying, hey, this right now, this is important, right?
Okay.
And again, your will is all driving of like, I'm hungry, I want this, I want food, I want sex, I want something to drink. It's the desires of that, or really our body of like, I need this to like survive. But that's something that we think through. And we might not even have a strong emotion. Now, if I have a foodie and I love food, I might have a very strong emotion to it that has been kind of attached to it. But the very basic, without even having that like emotional attachment, I just need something, and that's driving me to action. So all of them drive us to actions in certain ways, or can drive us to actions. But they are doing different things. So it's not necessarily that the heart will disagree with the cause and effect relationship, but it might drive us to a different action. And so I think there's a certain idea that if our mind, heart, and will are driving us to different actions, that might be because of an imbalance, potentially. It might be also that certain things happen to different things. You might have something that happens and it moves your heart because I'm in a marriage and my husband or wife, they said something to me and it upset me and that goes to my heart. And later on I find out, oh, this is actually what they meant, this is the context, and then all of a sudden I have information that I know, oh, I have a cause and effect, and okay, now I understand that, and now my heart is kind of satiated because of that. So there's sometimes where you might have certain things where like they might disagree, but in that case it's more of like the mind came and brought me information, and then my heart said, okay, I'm going to take that information, and that is I can recalibrate what I think is important in this, and that's going to change how I actually feel right now. So in that case, the heart has yielded to the mind's new information. Now, if somebody has maybe an imbalance, and this is like physically the case, if someone cannot regulate their emotions very well, even if the mind presents this new information, the heart may totally reject it and say, no, I felt this way, and this is how I feel, and this is the reality, and it might just totally reject it, even if there is new information that's added. And so I would say that is probably more of a state of imbalance, where it's not actually yielding. And in the same way, one can logically think a certain way, but if one then realizes that somebody is suffering, right? And before you don't know they're suffering, right? You just do whatever you're doing. And then later find, these people are suffering. This person's history is suffering. There's this. Wow, that moves my heart. And that's going to change how I think. Because now I know if this happens, these people are going to suffer. And I'm going to add that to my cause and effect calculation over here. So there's a certain sense that there is that's why I think Plato used the ideas of ruling. That there is a certain sense of one part can be able to influence the other, but it doesn't dominate it. Fully reject the other one or say, you must yield all the time to me. There's a sense of balance and working together.
So the balance is between, so it's not being blocked.
It's not being blocked.
So balance isn't necessarily flat.
It's
balance
not flat.
Is being able to move from one to the other.
Exactly, yeah. And to be able to, there are certain situations where one needs to lean more into one or the other. If you're doing clinical research for new pharmaceuticals, you're going to have to think more with your mind about certain things. But if you are doing a elementary school and you're doing preschool, there's a certain mind thing, but when you get down to the classroom and you get down to the level of the kids, you have to be with your heart a lot more. So you need this, in human life, you need all these things. If you're dealing with an obesity issue, you might have to really deal with your desires, right? Well, so it just depends. There are certain times where we have to do more, but because life is so multifaceted, we need to have this strength in all of them so that when we face certain things, we can know how to use them. Otherwise, we start using what we're strong in something else that doesn't require that, right? It's like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if one comes in, and this is one of the challenges you can have in an unbalanced society, if everything is logic and you think that's how I got here, that's how I made money, that's how I do things, and then you get to something that actually needs heart, but you bring just logic to it, it can lead to where you can end up in the wrong action for yourself or for others because you're not having that right set of balance. And so that's why you need a certain amount of strength, not because in every situation you're going to need all three in the same way, but because our lives invariably will need us to lean into different ones at different times.
So to answer your question about what we can do to bring the balance of it, I guess my answer would be to be more self-aware of when you're making certain decisions, if you're leaning more towards your logic, your emotions, or your desires.
That is certainly a very early part of it, yeah. I do think so. I think awareness is there. I think that's probably one of the first steps. I do think you probably have to do other things after that, but I think awareness is very early on. Yeah.
Something you were talking about that I feel more inclined to add now is like this notion of control seems quite important because like with balance, I think you have to start by understanding like kind of what you have control over, because I'm thinking in terms of, as people who like to, generally like we're all people that like to think of ourselves as like having a mind that can, push us to do things. We can think about something and execute on what we want to do. And a lot of life is learning the ways in which you fail to have that self-control and things like that. And I think a lot of like our improving understanding of the brain is just realizing how little volition and control you have over what you're doing at any given moment.
Yeah.
Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist who's kind of written a lot on how this impacts like people personally and culture, but he's always given this metaphor that has stuck with me of like, the way you think of the brain and the heart, we often imagine as like these two equal forces pulling on each other, but really what research continues to show is that you're kind of like a rider on an elephant. Like you have the ability to kind of pull the reins in a direction, but like this is very slow process of over weeks or months. You can sort of redirect the momentum of your life. And like the most easy experiment you can do for this is like, it seems like attention is one of the things that you have the most direct control over, but if you've ever tried just like pausing and meditating and like focusing on your breath, the realization that we do, and you study people that have never meditated or people that have meditating for 20 years, is they'll all say like they get interrupted about every like 20 seconds to a minute, if not more frequently, when you just try to focus on your breath. Like your body is constantly doing things to your mind, and the control you have is quite minimal. The other study I'm thinking of is like the brain is often like retroactively thinking it had control when it didn't. So there's all these reflexes we have in our body. It's the reason when you touch a hot stove, your hand pulls away. And we can do studies where like we will trigger that reflex and then post after the fact ask the person, why did you move your hand? And they'll give some intentional reason. I wanted to do it. I was pulling away because of this. And so we've learned that like a huge part of the brain is just making sense of what your body's already been doing. And so there's a real like hard aspect in which we learned that we have much less control than we think we do, the sort of conscious control. And so I think a lot of this balance comes down to thinking through and like just trying to spend time understanding like what do I actually have control over? And realizing cutting cold turkey, some habit you don't want, is probably not the best way to think about the control you have over your situation. That's just not how the brain works.
Yeah, it makes sense. I love your contribution. I love the idea of that elephant and that realizing it is really slow to turn. I think it's only as I've gotten older that I realized, it is very hard to change myself and things. And it's like almost impossible to change other adults. I can kind of change my kids, but even that is very difficult. But that recognition, that awareness, and I think that's what Susan you were talking about too, is what that awareness of that, both of where there might be an imbalance, and I think Connor, I think you mentioned that too as well. But then also this kind of like the difficulty of what it takes, like the challenge and the longevity that one would have to do to be able to change that. So I think that gets into a lot of what I was going to say a little bit earlier. I think those are all part of it. But as an overall summary, what I would say is like, what do you actually do? I think you have to look at the body, because whether it's the body or the soul, the thing you actually need is exercise. To find balance, to find health, to find all these things. It's actually exercise. You go, why exercise? Well, what do I mean by exercise? So, if you look at the Republic, Plato also talks about this. And he has the idea, we talked about virtue earlier. He says, the virtues of the soul, as they are called, they seem to be akin. They are just like the virtues of the body. Okay? There are some situations where the virtues are not innate. They are not inherited. They're not from birth in someone. We've talked about this before, why you cannot judge people. There's sometimes people, temperament, otherwise they don't have certain virtues, whether from their upbringing, other things like that. But even with that, they can be implanted by habit and by exercise, whether in the body or in the soul. And this word that he used there, exercise, is asceticism, or ascesis, asceticism, that's what it is. So, ascesis, that's where he's from. So, you might think, that actually becomes an important word. So, the Greek word ascesis was originally used to refer to physical exercises that brings discipline and health to the body. So, what happened over time? Plato began to use the word ascesis to refer to mental, spiritual, and willpower exercises that bring discipline and health to the soul. So this might be as an example of someone in the Near East, kind of a monk monastic, out in the desert, living out in the desert and following these kind of mental will practices as well too. So that's this idea. So Plato was early on in trying to think about this idea that just like our bodies clearly need exercise, our souls also need exercise. That's kind of what I was kind of getting to earlier, where like knowing the awareness of it is a beginning. But one could like know one needs to go to the gym, but no one's not going to get stronger and healthier just knowing it. But it is an important first step to know that one needs to go to the gym. And so that's the idea. And so there are actually this idea, like I said, it's in 370 BC, it influenced much of later centuries all across the world of what's kind of going on. And so there are different traditions of how to exercise and what that even looks like. That being said, because we are the West, and also I'm coming from meeting Zach at the local Orthodox Church, one thing I'm going to point out here is that one of the key places, if you look at the history of the Greek language, and you look at the history of the culture that it came from, Plato's use of the word ascesis eventually led to the development of the English word asceticism, okay, which refers to, as I said, various forms of self-discipline that have been developed and practiced and handed down by various philosophical and spiritual traditions, including in Christianity. And I'm going to point this out here because that is ultimately the spiritual tradition that the large, most of the Greek-speaking world eventually went into. And is in there that it became the larger understanding of ascesis, of asceticism. And so you have certain people, like this is St. Mark, who's referred to as St. Mark the Ascetic, one of these people living out in the wilderness and practicing these spiritual ascesis, exercises, asceticism. And so, particularly in the West, there is not often awareness of this whole part of history. So I thought it would be helpful to look at it because I think understanding it, whether one actually is Christian or not, this different forms of or expressions of the Christian spiritual tradition have so influenced Western society. So I think it's helpful to understand the history of it, to understand where it's come from, what might have been lost at certain points, and where even if you look somewhere else, you're going to end up kind of running into some of these questions yourself anyway. So that's why I wanted to bring it out here. And that's what happened. I can't talk at length about Zen Buddhism because that's not where I came from. Yes. So, but before we do that, I'm going to talk about what does Christian mean. I think it's an important thing to talk about. I said Christian asceticism, and you have an idea of this thing, crusade. What does it mean to be Christian? I don't know what it is. So again, I like with understanding psyche and the soul, I think it's helpful to go to the root of what the word means. So Christian is an adjective form of the word Christ, which comes from the Greek word Christos. And what Christos means is one who has been anointed with oil. That's what it means, right? What does that have to do with anything? Well, Christos thus refers to a ritual in which oil is smeared on the head of a special individual to mark that person as having a unique grace or charisma. We understand the idea of a charisma. Charisma, that's also a Greek word, charisma. That will enable a person to lead many other humans towards health, harmony, and justice. So there's the idea that, we have different rituals, how we choose our presidents and whatever they kind of do and say, hey, this person has been chosen. We have some ritual to say, this is the person we're all going to lead and follow. But this is an ancient idea of one needs to select and anoint a leader for you and mark this person out. This is the one that we're all going to respect. So the anointing is really that idea. So it's the idea of leadership, and particularly one of a unique kind of grace to lead people towards these things of health, harmony, and justice. So why that is, that later becomes pointed to what you might now know of is that having studied Plato for centuries, the descendants of the ancient Greeks, largely at a whole societal level, came to this conclusion that there's a Near Eastern teacher and prophet named Jesus, or in Greek, Jesus, who is the Christ, as in the one-of-a-kind leader that became the definitive model for how to lead humans towards health, harmony, and justice. And if you really break it down, that's originally what it means to be Christos, what it means to be anointed, what it means to be Christian. Not necessarily every bad or good thing that has happened in the religious structure afterwards, but that idea of this grace, this anointing on a particular person to lead people to health of their soul, that's really the idea. And this is something that if you ever spend the time, you don't think you have to, but you spend the time to go and look in the Bible, this is actually pointed out very clearly, even in Jesus' early parts. So this is from gospel. Gospel is a later English word for good news, like an announcement of a new king is actually what it means. Evangelion is the word in Greek, the good message or the good announcement. So this is a little scene from the Bible. You don't have to understand the whole context, but essentially it's the beginning of Jesus starting his public ministry, where he actually spent some time doing some exercises before he did this. But then he comes out and he finds a scroll that had been written a long time beforehand, centuries before, by within the Judean Israelite prophet tradition. And he went to his hometown and he gets this scroll, and that's what was pointed for that day to read. And so he read this thing where he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, for he has anointed me." And that's that word, Christos. He has anointed me to announce good news to the poor. He sent me to do what? To heal the brokenhearted. Healing is one of the very first things. Poor also has to do with the idea of the justice and the poor that have been downtrodden. To proclaim freedom from captives, also from slavery or from debt bondage, things like that. Recovering of sight to the blind, also more healing there. And delivery, and also insight, as in being able to, the blind is like, as metaphorically the people that don't know what to do. And delivery for those who are crushed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And then he sat down and said, today this scripture, this writing has been fulfilled in your hearing. So this idea of being an anointed one that leads to the people of healing of the soul was very clearly, at least the people that knew Jesus personally, that is what they thought that he was actually about. Okay. And this also mentioned that he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So, and we talked about spiritual traditions, I keep using it, so I feel compelled to, what does this mean, spirit? So what do I mean when I say spiritual? Does it mean believing in a God? Not necessarily, it doesn't have to. The English word spirit is a translation of the Greek word pneuma. The U actually is pronounced like a V when it's after an epsilon. Pneuma, which more concretely means wind or breath. This is the case in Greek. There's also a similar word, ruach, which is actually the exact equivalent word in Hebrew. So this idea is not unique to Greek. It's not unique to Hebrew. It generally was the way that ancient people thought about things. It's a metaphor and a way of understanding the world. It's actually concrete, wind or breath. So what do those have to do together, and what does that have to do with us translating it as spirit? So the word pneuma thus refers to any invisible force that creates an invisible change. Just like you go and you see some willows, the branches are moving, you can't really see the wind, but the invisible thing has made you be able to create this visible change. Or you can look at someone that is, it takes a breath and then goes underwater and swims, right? That breath that is invisible allows them to move and have activity because of it. So it's the idea of something that is invisible that creates this visible change to it. Is really the root idea of this word pneuma. So whenever that was later translated to spirit, in some cases, because if you actually go through like the textual situation of the Bible, you'll see that sometimes the word pneuma will be translated as spirit, sometimes it'll be translated as breath, and sometimes it'll be translated as wind. But it's all the same word in Greek. So whoever translated is trying to make a decision of which of these ideas the author meant. So when the translations in English use the word spirit, in that case, what I would say is pneuma can be understood as a pattern of thoughts, emotions, and desires that are shared among the souls of multiple persons. That's really the idea. The spirit is the idea of, again, the thoughts, the emotions, and desires. That is the mind, the will, and the heart. There is this idea that there are things that are invisible realities that affect a group of people at this larger level. And so we even use this colloquially in our language of saying, this place has a lot of school spirit. It affects how they think, what clothes they wear, the will of what they want to do, whether they're going to go to the Friday night game or not, how they feel when their team wins or like that they win the pep rally. This idea of school spirit, and it's shared among these sets of people. That there is idea that their soul is influenced by something that they don't necessarily choose, but they are part of it and influence them. And to me, that is the root of what it really means to mean spirit. And so kind of like I was saying earlier about you don't need to believe in an immortal soul to understand soul in the way I described to you. You don't have to believe in something outside of what you can see, other than the wind and things like that, to accept the idea that there is a certain idea of a spirit that affects people's souls, their mind, and heart. And that, at the core, is really what I'm trying to get at. And I think I would argue is what a lot of the kind of wisdom traditions are really trying to originally kind of get at. So that's the idea of a spirit. And so what it is that Jesus does claim to be the leader, or the Lord being leader, who shares a pattern of thoughts, emotions, and desires that will bring healing to human souls. And I think that is, again, the message that we saw in that, that announcement that Jesus made in that narrative, and very much what his own followers thought that he was doing. Okay. So, that leads to what kind of ascetical practices did Jesus provide for humans to share in this pattern of thoughts, emotions, desires that heal the soul? So I don't know if you guess. I don't expect everyone to know this. But the answer is there's the ascetical practices of contemplative prayer, fasting, and giving or forgiving. Are these kind of three areas that Jesus kind of modeled himself and taught his followers to actually do. This can be seen in the most famous set of teachings that Jesus made. It's often called the Sermon on the Mount. It's in like the 5th chapter of Matthew. It's a very long, very influential thing that influenced Gandhi, it influenced Martin Luther King. It's a lot of things about how to see the world in this different way that leads people to peace and joy, even through suffering and even through challenges. That's the whole thing about. But within this, there's a particular section where right in a row, Jesus talks about, and he gives specific instructions of how his followers should pray. And not pray as in like, oh, I want to ask for a Lamborghini, or I want to ask for this to happen, or I want to ask to get an A on the test. But contemplative prayer, things that are thinking of a life certain way. It might be meditating on a certain idea, like Psalm 1. Bless the one who follows the instruction of the Lord, of the leader, right? That person will be like a tree planted by the streams of water, which bears its fruit in season and whose leaves do not wither, and everything he does prospers, right? Is the idea of like, oh, when I follow things that are going to care about other people, they're going to lead other people to health, I become like a tree that has fruit, that isn't withered because I have water and because I know what to do, and it also be the same word influences other people. So it's that's an example of what I would say is what I mean by contemplative prayer. It's not about me asking for something as much as having one mind focus on what is perfect, what is truly good, what is truly leading to health for myself and others. And you actually have to spend time thinking about that and find where that comes from and be able to have that going more into your mind. So that's what I mean by contemplative prayer. So that is an exercise of the mind, of what one is thinking about, one's reflecting, and one seeing what it means and where one falls short. This is also part of what you're getting at, how to be aware that you are imbalanced. I think Colin mentioned that as well. There's a certain amount of knowing what is balanced, what does look like it's healthy. And one has to be meditating on it to even know where one is at. So there's the idea of contemplative prayer. Giving to those in need and forgiving those are meant to exercise the heart. Because as I've kind of alluded to earlier, if one cares about the longer history of a person, whether that be their life and what has happened to them, whether that be their whole ethnic group and what happened to their ancestors and how that still affects them, that is exercising our heart to feel in a way outside ourselves and towards others, right? And that is both. One can actually call both of those forgiving. And what I mean by that is when one gives to someone and doesn't expect anything in return, that to some extent is you are forgiving a debt. Once you give someone, they kind of have a debt, even if it's just kind of like a social debt, so like they have to be nice to you or something. But to truly say, unconditionally, I'm giving this to you. And you don't have to even treat me well because of this. That is forgiving. There's no debt. I've forgiven a debt. But in the same way, when someone wrongs us, when they've something wrong, it might be a parent that wrongs us. It might be the person that cut me off when I was driving 10 years ago. That thing, right? Like, there's a certain sense of forgiving that is releasing them because when they've done something wrong, they owe me back. And I need to release them from that to some degree to, at least to be considered forgiving. And so that's an exercise of the heart as well, too. And then additionally, there is fasting. Fasting from certain foods or at certain times. Not necessarily all the time, but there might be certain seasons or certain periods of the day or week where one is fasting. Maybe it's total fast. Maybe it's not eating certain things. Maybe it's eating a vegan diet. Maybe it's not eating certain periods of time. The idea that is exercising the will because your belly wants this thing. You can survive, with some reasonable amounts of fasting, but it's not what your belly desires, right? And so the idea of going against it is also this idea of an exercise of a form of asceticism. So it's really in these things of prayer, of giving, of fasting. If everyone's read through it, it's in Matthew chapter 6. They're all there in a sequence to lead to these are the exercises of the soul. Okay. So that is what's there. Now, what is interesting is that in the decades and centuries after Jesus' public ministry, that he announced and he taught these things, there are numerous individuals that dedicated their lives to Christian asceticism. Again, this anointed one. Again, Jesus is the anointed one. He's leading me. I'm going to follow this way of leading in this way as well, too, and experience this kind of grace and charisma to be able to do things that will ultimately help others. There are people that lived in this ascetical practice, and it did bring a significant amount of discipline, harmony, balance to their souls. But it's kind of dispersed in terms of what happens. But one of the big pivot points in the history of the Roman society, generally speaking, which led to the rest of European society, the modern times in particular, what happened is that there became a systematic use of Christian ascetical practices, and it really began to spread due to the lived example of a man known as St. Anthony, who is considered to be the father of Christian monasticism. Monasticism really means living alone, not getting married to someone else, and focused particularly on ascetical practices and focusing on the soul, not necessarily just for oneself, but ultimately, as we've been saying earlier, that one can be healed so that one knows how to heal others. That's really the idea here. So, life of St. Anthony, hope to understand. So, St. Anthony was born in Egypt in 251 AD. This is actually before Christianity was legalized, so it was like a persecuted religion at the time. A lot of people were killed. So he was raised then in 251 AD. When he was about 20 years old, both of his parents died, and they left him with like wealth as inheritance. And so about 6 months later, he'd grown up, around. He'd been taking care of his parents up until that point. About 6 months later, St. Anthony went to a church service and he heard a reading from the Bible. It was a different reading than we read earlier, but a similar kind of thing, where Jesus taught that a person who wants his soul to be perfect should sell all that they have, give to the poor, and devote themselves to following Jesus' way of life. Not that one could live a good life, it's not judgment of people, but if one really wants to find the best way to perfect the soul, which is, again, what Plato and the other philosophers talked about. How does one find ways of health for the soul? How does one become as much as one is able to mature? And the word in Greek, what we translate as perfection, often, particularly in these kind of texts, is the word teleos, which means to come to an end, which comes to maturity. It's also what's spoken of like children become adults, or teleos, to become perfect. It means whole and well then, as everything that they're meant to be. Okay. So how does one do that? That's how one becomes perfect, mature. So St. Anthony concluded that this teaching and everything that happened, he no longer had to take care of his parents. He concluded that the teaching applied specifically to him. And so because of that, he actually went and did it. He sold all his property. He gave money to the poor, which is already a form of giving, as I mentioned earlier. And then he also sold the rest of his inheritance and gave it to the poor. And he went to live in a desert cave where he devoted himself to praying, fasting, and forgiving. So those are those three forms of ascetical practices that he went into. It's a long story of what actually happened when he was out there. But eventually, after nearly 40 years of praying, fasting, and forgiving, eating very small amounts of things out in the wilderness, and living alone in a desert cave, St. Anthony's soul reached a state of perfect harmony and health for practicing these things. And what happened is eventually he was visited. And so soon there were several other men came, and they met him, and they saw that how his soul responded to things was actually very different than what they experienced. Again, it's off the statistical manual, but in a way that's actually healthy, is what he actually was experiencing. And so they asked to become his followers. So within a really short period of time, in a few years, the people came and they started staying with him. And so they're like, well, we're going to live out here. There's more than one of us. We all can't fit in this cave. They started building little dwellings, little houses. First kind of little small little huts or communities, and then larger ones. And so these were the earliest monasteries within the Christian tradition. And again, this is all in the Egyptian desert. So several monasteries were built, and then people from the cities would come to receive spiritual guidance from St. Anthony. Some of them would actually remain there and live this kind of life of asceticism with him and following his practices and live and not get married or things like that. And others would actually just go there for a period of time, gain the insight and wisdom, learn how to do these practices, and bring it back to where they were living in the cities and learn how to practice it there. And learn how to find that healing of their soul wherever they were. And so the practice isn't, again, this is the idea this idea of reaching health. It's almost like becoming a jujitsu instructor. I know she does jujitsu. So it's like you know how to fight the things that you're dealing with. And after that, you know how to teach other people, right? How to fight the things, how to overcome. And this person's going to do this, well, you do this. If this person's going to do this, if they do this, this is what you do. It's the exact same thing. If this desire comes out, if these thoughts come out, if you really are upset about that guy that cut you off 10 years ago, what do you do? There is a certain way of you can tell someone that, but you have to really practice it to really have that idea. When whatever comes up for all these different souls, how do you guide someone about what to do in that situation? And that's what St. Anthony became. He's this person that can do that, whether people stayed with him permanently or he sent them back to the world and they went and did that. And so eventually a prominent church leader named St. Athanasius, that's my patron saint, that's the person I'm actually named after. He spent time with St. Anthony and was so inspired by his life, he wrote a biography of St. Anthony's life. And this biography became immensely popular across the Greek-speaking world and made St. Anthony the model for all later Christian monastics, men and women. And so that is really how St. Anthony became the father of monasticism and really influenced the course of these practices of the soul for healing. Now, what is interesting is what happened after this. So this, as I mentioned before, this happened in Egypt, in the deserts. And then from there, it spread very quickly to the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. It spread particularly to like Palestine, Syria. Similar landscape, there's deserts out there. They have similar cultural traditions. They all were places that generally had been taken over by Alexander the Great and were Greek-speaking, but had lots of libraries, a lot of reading, had a lot of they all had read Plato and all of these things, and were looking at ways of wisdom. And so within that, there was this kind of interesting merger of this philosophy of spiritual practice, all the things like that. And it spread very quickly and had a very similar scope of monasticism in those regions. So that's in what's the eastern part, which is what we later call the Eastern Roman Empire. Very soon, within a few 100 or more years, there were certain people that came from the west and came to the east and found these monasteries. St. John Cassian, St. Benedict were some of the earlier ones. And they basically saw the value in this, and they brought it back to the west. And there, they didn't have many deserts, so they would go out to the forest or islands. So a lot of British isles used to have monasteries and things. A lot of other places in the Mediterranean became places where they would kind of go and live these isolated lives, kind of what St. Anthony was doing in the desert. And that became how monasticism kind of spread from the east, from Egypt, out to the west. However, initially, the Western spirituality modeled monastic practices on the pattern from the Eastern Christianity. However, over the centuries, Western Christianity began to drift from Eastern Christianity because of language, culture, other different kind of reasons. And this eventually led to the Great Schism, or the split between the Latin-speaking Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Greek-speaking Orthodox Church in the East. And this was about 1054, the 11th century. It's about 1,000 years after Jesus. So this kind of led to the split in culture and language, other things like that. So having lost this kind of spiritual and just brotherly connection between the West and the East, the Western culture increasingly lost sight of the purpose of Christian monasticism. It was seen as maybe something of just, I was saying before, it's about the immortality of the soul and going into there, that was the way they understood it. But in the East, as I was trying to point out earlier, even if one didn't accept the immortality of the soul, there's the idea that these things are for our healing right now. And for the development of people and development of society and bringing goodness to the world. And I think that was often very lost in the West. And so what eventually happened about 500 years after the split was there was a monastic from the West in the early 1500s named Martin Luther. He's a Western monastic, and he became increasingly disillusioned with the teachings and practices of the Roman Catholic Church, particularly looking at the spiritual practices, which, if you know the history, it's called indulgences, of trying to pay money to deal with what's happening in the afterlife for other people, and also him seeing his monastic things as being all about him trying to get through things to get better things in the afterlife. That was the kind of focus that they saw in the West at the time. He became increasingly disillusioned with that and saw that there was corruption, there was other things going on, and so he started to distrust monasticism and this idea of these ascetical practices. So ultimately, he kind of wrestled with it for some while, but he ultimately rejected the whole Roman Catholic tradition. And that is what triggered the Protestant Reformation, which in turn led to the beginnings of the modern world. It is really Martin Luther that broke the traditional way of how society was organized in the West that really led to everything about what is now the modern world. So while he originally intended to simply reform the Roman Catholic Church, the Reformation ultimately led to a very vast splintering of Western Christianity into dozens of Protestant church traditions. So many of the ones that are there you might just be faintly aware of driving around. That really came at this point where there was this large splintering, particularly in the West, away from the Roman Catholic Church. And additionally, also, because Martin Luther really advanced the idea of you can't really judge any tradition and decide things for yourself. Maybe he thought that other people would decide on the way that he thought, but of course people thought differently, which is why there's many different church traditions. But also, as people thought, it's maybe I have deism. God kind of exists, but he's not involved. Agnosticism, I can't really know anything about God. Atheism, God doesn't exist at all. In ways, all of these are outworkings of Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation, of saying that we're not going to go things by tradition, it's really by the individual and how they decide things. And so, no judgment on anything, that's history, that's how things come from. And why I'm pointing it out, not to judge any particular group or say things are better than the other, is just to say that almost all of these groups gradually disregarded, either rejected outright from the beginning, or gradually disregarded the monastic tradition. It was just fundamental to how Martin Luther thought, that it really influenced everything about the modern world, regardless of where. Even if people say Christian, they generally rejected the monastic tradition over time. So that is kind of the history of where we are in the West and what can happen. But there's still this need, which maybe I'm starting to get you to think about, even though I haven't convinced you. And what eventually happened, as I mentioned, 1700s, Enlightenment, psychology becomes about the study of the mind. As the philosophies inspired by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment gradually displaced a spiritual approach to the soul, Western societies developed a mind-focused, secularized version of psychology to address mental health issues. As we talked about, we're still on the fifth DSM. It's constantly evolving what we understand, and it's not perfect, but it's the best we got. Right, and stuff. It can do some great things. It can do some bad things. That's where it's at. That's a state. That's a whole other topic. But that's what happened. But what I do think is fascinating, particularly in the last 15 years, is that, ironically, when this secularized version of psychology reached certain limits, not in all limits, but in certain ways, of its effectiveness, it became actually very popular for Western psychologists increasingly look to fill in these perceived gaps by actually adapting ascetical practices. Such as mindfulness meditation, which were usually taken from monasteries in non-Christian spiritual traditions. I find this kind of ironic because, as I said, this was largely rejected from the modern West. But then you get to it and you realize, actually, we really need this stuff. But we actually rejected it. And we can't really go back there, so let's try to find somewhere else where we can also kind of find it. It's an interesting kind of history. But there was ultimately a realization that actually humans all need ascetical practices. We actually just all do. Which is ironically one of the things that Martin Luther initially just rejected. So last thing, what I would point out to this and how I've come to be aware of this, both in just mentally aware and starting to practice these things in my life, is actually through the Orthodox Church, which I didn't grow up Orthodox. So I grew up in a Protestant evangelical. So a lot of the stuff I'm mentioning, I had no idea about when I was growing up. And so this is just part of my own background to show how it comes from, but also to understand this history of what has been even in the West, but has been muddled or lost. And what I'm going to point out is that despite the fact the modern Western world was profoundly shaped by the Protestant Reformation and Enlightenment, in the last 120, 150 years, immigration from Eastern countries to Western countries, and also a greater access to information, particularly on the internet most recently, but even the past few decades on books and things, has led to actually a rapid growth in the Eastern Orthodox Church in the West in recent decades. Largely because people, like me, have realized these limitations of even in their spiritual traditions, of realizing there's something that is beyond just what happens after my life and about how I live now that is needed. And a lot of people have come into the church because they recognize this. And so to support the spiritual lives of Orthodox Christians and also others who aren't even Orthodox, or Christians, who might be interested in using these historic, traditional Christian ascetical practices to bring harmony and health to their souls, there are dozens of Orthodox monasteries that have been established in Western countries. And the one I actually most recently went to, and is actually within driving distance, is there's actually one of the largest and one of the most influential of these monasteries is a monastery that's appropriately St. Anthony's Monastery, the founder of monasticism, that's actually in a desert just outside of Phoenix in Florence, Arizona. And so I just want to connect it because this thing that is ancient is there, it's actually here now. It's something that exists here, and people, for various reasons, have realized this, whether that's in the Christian tradition or the Orthodox one, or even outside of it. My point about this is to point this out that I think all souls, that we all have a mind, will, and a heart. We have souls. And one way or another, we need excess, we need asceticism. And one has to find a way to that one way or the other. And that's kind of the point that I wanted to bring out. So, yeah. Takeaways, within the context of the Greek philosophy, so just kind of summary takeaways, within the context of Greek philosophy and the Orthodox Christian spirituality, the word soul refers to the interconnected system of the mind, heart, and will, which distinguishes a living body from a dead corpse. The word asceticism is used to translate the ancient Greek word for exercise and refers to practices that train the soul to achieve health, harmony, and justice. Christian asceticism has historically looked to the teachings of Jesus and the examples of monastic saints as examples for how to practice asceticism through prayer, fasting, giving, and forgiving. And the traditional Christian ascetical practices were largely abandoned by modern Western culture, but have been preserved and disseminated by numerous Eastern Orthodox monastics over the centuries. And that's the summary of my talk on the three-part soul and the need for asceticism. Ooh.
Nailed it.
Thank you. That's encouraging. Again, I don't know how to land and stuff like that, but that's encouraging.
That was good.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, sure.
So we need it because I'm not sure of the answer to that question. Like, we need asceticism because, like,
I think the same way that you need exercise. Your body needs exercise.
right? But there's so 3 parts: fasting,
Mm-hmm.
Giving,
Mm-hmm.
and there was another one. What
The
was
templative prayer.
Prayer. Okay. Okay. So in different ascetic traditions, prayer might be meditation. If you're, part of Buddhism or whatever, I don't know that they actually pray. Not sure, but
There are prayers in Buddhism, but the monastic tradition is going to be more heavy in the meditation side. But there are definitely prayers. But it's also the same thing in Christianity. There are prayers, but also if you go to a monastery, it's going to be like heavily meditative.
okay. So and then the giving, or forgiving.
Yeah.
I usually think of asceticism as being people who give everything away and they live on very small means, but that doesn't necessarily follow through every single monastic tradition. I know, you have like the Tibetan monks who seem to live a very simplistic life, and there are others who do that as well, but not everybody does that. So there's like, I guess you could say there's a wide range of asceticism. It's up there, giving and fasting. And then the fasting, so, I know people who do fasting specifically for physical reasons because, the modern science tells you that it has benefits to your body, but people who are doing fasting for spiritual reasons, like if you do it long enough, you can actually receive or you can get to a spiritual plane that wouldn't be available to you had you not done this fasting. Like my father did a long period of fasting and then said he went through I forget how he put it, but I would say it was probably like a euphoria. Have you experienced that through fasting?
I won't talk too much about my experience, but I would say it definitely changed my mind and my heart. And I mean, it starts with the desire, changed what I desire definitely. And there is, I'll say these really simple things. Like when I had a 1-year-old, I started getting into more of a regular fasting routine. What I will say is like when I did it, and I was exactly whatever I did. Whenever I like ate something the next time, I don't know if I'd ever been as thankful for food. And it wasn't even like it was like I was like absolutely starving at the end, but it's just like from that going through this like discipline thing and like really starting to like learn to start to do it. My goodness, when I just had just like a bread or a cereal, I was so thankful. And it really helped me to be thankful, so to notice the things in like other things in my life that I was thankful for that I often just took for granted. So that's one small thing, I think, and that's something that is very accessible, I think, for almost anybody if they do something like that. Like that's a very accessible thing. There are clearly other kind of higher spiritual states that people in Christianity and other traditions have experienced, and I do think that's also there too as well. And I wouldn't speak to the best because I'm not a perfect practitioner, and I'm still learning things. But what I will say is like I definitely experienced a range of certain things, and I will point out that as like a very like I wouldn't say basic. It's very fundamental because so much of even health, thankfulness is just such a core part of health and wellness, generally speaking. Even if simple, it's there. But yeah, there's things that comes from fasting. It's definitely a core idea. Yeah.
Do you think that there's a realm of within the healthy space and where all of this can go into unhealthiness?
All of it can go. I've had a conversation with Susan a lot about anything that is a powerful tool can be used for good or for ill. And anything that is like a powerful tool can be used for good. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a part of the brain, like the reason. It doesn't matter if it's weaponry. It doesn't matter if it's Christianity, if it's like the internet, if it's social media. Anything that's powerful can be used for good or evil. Like that's just the fact. And so yeah, all of these things can be used in a way that like lead to good and health and can lead to ill. And so yeah, as you noted, even within a particular spiritual tradition, there is a range of monastic practices. The Catholic one particularly has a very wide range of monasticism. Like some like are, in some extent all priests are kind of monks to some extent because they don't get married. But also like there's some things that they live individually, they apart. There are some different, where they're more about social good stuff. It really varies. And so whether between different spiritual traditions or even within one, there can be a lot of range of monastic practices. And so there's a certain set of wisdom that is built on different ones. And I'm not saying that any one of these is even one tradition is going to be better. To some extent, I do think that what I'll say is even from the Christian tradition, or the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which is what I know. There are some that might be better suited for certain people than others. There might be some where people are going to live as hermits, and they're going to live really individually for themselves. And that might be what they need to deal with, particularly if they are really used to just like getting a lot of praise for other people. That might be the thing that they need to work on and be healthy. But there might be somebody that is just like predisposed to being antisocial, that maybe the being in a hermit isn't actually going to work on their soul the best way, and they actually need to be in a monastic community where they're sharing rooms, they're meeting together frequently, people deal with those things in their soul. Right. So even when some people can believe maybe the same thing about the cosmos and who they should listen to, they might individually need different expressions of monasticism, of ascetical practices to deal with the particular condition, the health or illness of their own soul. And I think that is why there's wisdom. And again, that's why you have jujitsu teachers. Because people that have seen, wherever they exercise, other things like that, they have seen enough things to be like, you need this. No, you need this thing over here. So it all kind of depends, but it is, and that is why it's not all just one thing. It's not a pill. It's a lived experience, and it's a wisdom of life of how to respond to everything. And like that is what, one way or another, people have to build themselves. And I think what traditions historically have done is certain people have become these anointed ones, these leaders that have this charisma of understanding this enough to be able to guide people along the way. That's what I would say. But yeah, it takes a lot of wisdom. Not something that, and this is also why, when I'm saying this, I don't mean like go and read your next book about whether it be the Philokalia, that's like the Eastern Orthodox one, or if you go to read some other Zen Buddhist thing and just start doing it yourself. I would probably advise you not to do that because it will probably lead you to destructive things. Like even if being Christian, I would say if you just go and pick up some 18th century text that has a monastic wisdom, you never go to church and you start doing that, you will probably lead yourself to really destructive things because you won't have wisdom about how to use it. No one is guiding you. And in the same way, there is a very well established now understanding of a lot of just a mindfulness tradition, which has even that itself has been very intentionally removed from the spiritual tradition where it's come from. But it is initially a spiritual tradition, and it was removed to become a secularized version. But even just with that, there are many people that have gotten deep into meditative starting with mindfulness, and have had very horrible mental states and trauma because of it. There is a place, I think it's in New Haven. I think it's in New Haven. I think maybe it's I think it's there. But there's a place called Cheetah House. You can look it up. It's a play on the word cheetah, which is come from the Hindu, I think it's Hindu tradition, but something there. But there are people who have had these really horrible experiences where it really affects their mind, their body. They can't meditate. They have really bad things that happen to them and stuff like that. And it's actually it has become it initially was to do research into mindfulness practices, but it actually ended up becoming kind of like a halfway house for people that had had really bad meditative experiences that led them to breakdowns or something like that. And so they're kind of helping to heal people that have gone through things. So they in particular, from the research that they've been trying to do, I think associated with Brown, have been trying to kind of get people to understand one thing, which is that these practices are very good and are very powerful, but they actually are inherently spiritual practice traditions. And the goal of them, is in this wider set of things of life and of wisdom. And if one just takes part of it, which Wes likes to do, you might be missing the other things that are balanced. If nothing else, the fact that you need a guide for a lot of these things, because whatever tradition, if you look at any monastic tradition, I don't care if it's Zen Buddhism, I don't care if it's if it's Orthodox Christianity, there are people that get to it and experience these heightened states, but then also experience something within the Christian tradition they would talk about as being evil spirits, which is negative thoughts, emotions, things like that can really be destructive. And it's really with a guide that has been and seen the landscape of it that can guide people through those things. And so historically, this idea that one would just do it by himself just wasn't how things were done. You have guide, you have people, and you find somebody who is an anointed one, who is someone who has gone through it, who has suffered, who has gone through stuff that they can teach you to be able to do things. And so, so I said, yes, it takes a lot of wisdom, and that is why they are traditions. Tradition, again, from the Greek word, it means to hand something down. There are certain things that you can write all out in books and it's helpful, but there's a certain lived experience that you get from being a child with your parents, that you get from living under a particular teacher. And anyone that has been part of these practices, they were going to say that have actually done them. They're like, oh, I couldn't have done this without my teacher, my guide, whatever that person is. And so it's really that idea. So it's not an individual, and this again, we tend to think individualistically, but it's not. These weren't formed as things that were supposed to be done inherently individualistically, and it takes a lot of discernment and wisdom. And the people that were pioneers, like St. Anthony, they were very strong souls to be able to pioneer that. But it's not, they did that, for other people, right? My hip hop line's here. The Jay-Z has a line where he talks about how he raps about selling drugs a lot. And then he's like, people acting like I sold you crack, like I told you sell drugs, because he raps about drugs all the time. He's like, no, Hove did that, as he's referring to himself. So hopefully you don't have to go through that. And there's a certain idea of like, why is it that we have these ideas of Christ, of these people that are anointed ones, that are like saints, that are going there, that are saints? Is because not all of us can go through that. But there are certain people that for whatever reason have this grace, have this charisma to be that thing for a certain set of people. And they go through and bring that wisdom. And we might have to also go through a certain amount of suffering, a certain amount of guidance. They might have that kind of dark night of the soul that they're talking about. But because someone else has gone through it and there's been a strong enough soul to do it, then we have enough guidance and ability to kind of get through whatever we face. Again, even within Christianity, that's the whole story of the idea of Jesus on the cross. The whole idea is someone who is trying to suffer while doing what is good and loving others, that then inspires you to, hey, through these practices, whatever suffering you face, it's not quite what he had to do, but like he was able to do this and love and forgive. And so even though it's difficult for me to forgive that person that cut me off 10 years ago, that's still something that I have this wisdom and this encouragement and this history of people to do. So that's kind of this like larger idea. But yeah, it takes it in. Everything's connected. Like I said, the society is connected to the individual, the body is connected to the soul, the parts connect to each other. And humans, we are connected to a tradition of wisdom that can be passed on. And whether we realize or not, we are influenced by the wisdom. Even if we think we're individual, there's all kind of wisdom in people and movies and things like that has gotten into your head and your heart that actually very much informs how you live, whether you recognize it or not. And what I'm trying to get people to understand, regardless of where they are, regardless of what they think or believe, is to get people more and more to recognizing the wisdom tradition that already inside of them. And just to be aware of it is a big thing to be able to find anything beyond what we have now, individually or at societal level.
So when I look at like the ascetic practices you mentioned, like one of my first thoughts was, Plato, in his reflections on what brings unity to the soul, probably would have added something like everyone should study geometry.
Pythagoras definitely would have done it.
But so I guess so. My point is like, how do you relate like these three practices that I do think, like, I'm certainly not going to object to the value of them and their relationship to maybe other practices that have taken pretty prime roles for people to think about bringing harmony to the soul. So like in the case of Plato, and I think his schools, he would have emphasized the importance of sort of mathematical thinking, not because he liked people to learn math, but because he saw it as like sort of the prime exercise of the mind, to like understand the world. I think you could probably say that throughout history there have been other emphasis on like the value of potentially like, political action and organizing. Like, so I don't know if you put that in giving, but like the ability to actually like organize communities and like put people towards an end as like a certain sort of like practice that is virtuous for the soul. So like, do you see these as sort of a core, or do you see them as like, one among potentially growing body that just happen to be important in the Christian tradition?
That's a great question. Great question. What I will say is that if you look at the traditions that have survived over time, and by somewhat social proof have like proved to be beneficial for people, they almost all do some forms of these things. Mm-hmm. It happened because I think it's core to our humanity. And it's core to like how the soul actually functions. And like I said, like the prayer is the mind, the giving is the heart, like the fasting is the will. Like those are just the parts from the way of that system of understanding. That's just really how the soul is constructed within that framework. And thus it makes sense that people would use these practices. Mm-hmm. So I don't think Jesus is necessarily even unique in it. And in fact, when he taught about it, he didn't even say like, oh, here is like fasting. It's like more of like when you fast. It actually assumes that people already know these things, that they're doing them, even outside of the tradition. So that's what I would say is like, one, I would say is like if you actually look at traditions, like they're doing some form, particularly if you really understand what prayer is or what giving can be. When you really break it down, it's like people are also doing these things in other traditions. So that's what I would say. What I would also say is there's a certain aspect of, because these things are not intellectual, they're lived experiences. Mm-hmm. And so the proof of them isn't necessarily to that they are fully logically correct. The proof of them is the transformed souls. Mm-hmm. And so to some degree, it is practicing yourself and being around people that have been formed by this way that assesses how these practices are used for or good. I think that's what it is. It's a very lived experience thing rather than just a theoretical thing. That's what I would say. I think the third thing I would say in particular the Plato one about the mathematical things, I would put that very close to like the contemplative prayer part of it, because what it's getting at is an exercise of the mind of understanding form and beauty and perfection and other things like that. And to some extent, if I'm talking to somebody that really has more trouble dealing with the idea of a deity or something like that, what I would break it down in the same is like, well, it's about like understanding like what does it mean to be perfect? What does it mean for like the mind to like actually be perfect and all good and leading to goodness for oneself and one's others? And a lot of times, even the stuff about the contemplation of like the music of the spheres and things like that Plato was talking about, that also ended up in other traditions too as well, including in Christianity too as well. So, and the other thing I would say, I try to help people understand this too, is like in the West, we tend to think of spirituality as a cutoff. It's just this thing, and then this is math, and then this is political thing. But there's no way people would have thought about that way. Because, like I said, even like if you read the Bible, the first thing that it says is like, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was formless, and then the ruach of God was hovering over the waters. And that word there is that word ruach that means breath, wind, and spirit. Now, the first sentence, it doesn't explain to you what breath is or what wind is. You can have a whole scientific thing of explaining it and meditating on it, and there's a lot of meditative practices that focus on the breath. So it assumes you've lived a life, that you know things about it, and that's going to be part of what you are going to bring into your contemplative tradition or your practices. So there's the idea that even shapes and forms and understanding, okay, triangles, right? Within the Christian tradition, well, that's gonna be leading you to understanding the Trinity of like the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and this idea that there is a unity that also maps to this three-part soul, but also maps to the idea of rule, but like proper submission, that has to the idea of being invisible, of being physically present, and being like moving among that. It's a whole contemplative tradition to understand ourselves and to understand what is the reality of the world. So I think with Plato, I don't think that's actually that far off from how I generally understand contemplative prayer. It's just that he's picking on a certain set of things to contemplate, but other spiritual traditions might choose on a wider one, or say, actually, that's a good start. That massive thing, you could do a lot of contemplation with just that. But like, let's add some other things that are going to be more directly relevant, or connect more to your life. And maybe for a very strong soul, they can actually just look at the triangle, thing like that, and that will lead them to like a lot of the contemplation of the perfect. But most people probably not. And so I think what you see a lot in other traditions is they're helping you to create this bridge so that those anointed ones, those Christians, those anointed souls, are helping people that might even not be out there in the desert. They might just come back. But how can you find that? That actually could be that tree of life, that fruit for other people. And so I think that's what the Christian tradition, I think other traditions are trying to do, is provide that bridge. I think the last part you said is the political action. There is a certain aspect where I think a lot of the heart of what we value about political action, when we're not maybe cynical about it, is I think the heart and like the love behind it. Mm-hmm. I do think that's probably, if we're going to boil it down, I think that's probably what we would probably care about. And I think in that, I think that is very much centered as a way of giving in that way. Mm-hmm. Whether that be of a donation. If someone's donating to a political cause, it's largely because they think that if I'm being empathetic and generous to people, which I think I should, that they think that it will make the world society better in some way. And they might think that these other people or this other group or this other policy is making it better, and like this will lead to a better society. And thus, by me doing this, I am creating more goodness in the world, which in its heart is trying to love. Now, it might be misguided. It might be something that leads to extremism or something like that. But that's a misunderstanding. Maybe the mentally they don't understand that. Maybe the heart they don't understand that. But it is an effort of trying to get there. And so I do think that if one does, there is a way of seeing giving, whether that be charity, right? Charity itself comes from a Latin word that is a translation of the Greek word agape, which is the Christian word for unconditional love. like charity in of itself was like an originally a Christian word to define this idea of doing what is good for others without expecting anything in return. So, and a lot of what is political, the strongest things are this idea of doing things because for this idea of other people, even outside of myself. Yeah, there's people that do political things for just my own good. That's also the case. But yeah, I do think that there can be a purified way of acting in the polis that is can be a form of part of the ascetical tradition, particularly when it is difficult and challenging and something that ultimately like leads one to that more purified soul. I think it's also very easy to do things in a lot of other different directions. And I think that is also why Plato talked about the idea that it actually becomes internal. That it starts internal. Mm-hmm. That a lot of these practices start as things that are internal and they blossom and come out to things that are external. And so one can jump into the political thing but not have done the internal work. And I think it's maybe harder to do it as an ascetical practice that way, but one can also start it as something that is in the soul, and that expression becomes part of a larger ascetical practice, I think.
One thought I have, Steve actually shared something with me earlier this week, or last week. It came to my mind when you were talking about the elephant, and about just another image I got was like, there's a big boulder, and how do you destroy that? You just have to chip away at it for years and years and years, basically, or like erosion happens over a long period of time. There was a story about, it was like a woman who didn't want to be near this monk because she thought he was like losing his mind and she didn't want to be around him. And he would like mumble to himself. And he actually had dementia. But there was a period of time where she actually had to sit next to him. And she noticed that he actually wasn't mumbling. He was just saying the Jesus prayer over and over again. So it kind of shows that the force of habit and exercise over a long period of time, even if your mind, your conscious mind, your memory goes, it's so deep that it's just formed his entire life, and his attention is, even when his actual like mind, he can't reason, he's not there in that way, he's still there praying. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, it was a mind-blowing story.
Well, you know that people with dementia, often the last thing to go is music. Like if a person in an Alzheimer's unit might get to a piano and just play something that they know, but they can't remember what happened, in the morning.
And then one other thought is just that the general theme of like something that just kept coming through and through in what you're sharing is the ancient wisdom that like modern science, we're just so progressive, we just make these discoveries, and then you read Plato and it's like, oh, it's there. You look at ancient Christianity, oh, it's there. And even just, it's funny, I'll just share a personal story of something that was coming to me too as I was listening was, I just had this conversation with my principal at my school, because I was asking, could I get professional development for, if I were to go to a conference on the integration of like Orthodox spirituality and mental health care. And she said, well, Zach, what would you use that for? Like, first off. I said, well, if I had some Orthodox or Christian students, and they wanted to integrate spirituality, but even that word integrate, right? The fact that these things are split. But then she actually said, Zach, it is actually, it's this whole thing, it's all BS. She's like, we got rid of prayer in schools, but we just call it, mindfulness meditation is okay. And she sent me something over the weekend that was a screenshot of what another high school was doing for Mental Health Awareness Month, which is this month. And some things they were doing was like Tai Chi and like sound bowl. And I had a conversation with Father Justin. We were talking about how you can't divorce a practice from its spiritual roots. Mm-hmm. Nothing is spiritually neutral. And so my principal was actually just saying, look, they're just calling this, whatever, it's just a stretching, or it's just, but something Father Justin shared was, well, what do you think if you were to like say, let's do a sign of the cross and prostrations, but it's not Orthodox spirituality. Are you buying that? Like, no. So it's just kind of funny to think about how, psychology, even as you're like presenting, it's like psychology and like spirituality so integrated. Mm-hmm. Like even talking about how you define spirit and soul. And then like in the West we split everything down, but then you learn like all this stuff is coming into mental health care now where we actually need the body. We need to talk about the body. Mm-hmm. The body has a huge part in healing, actually. Mm-hmm. We can't just like think of psychology as just the mind. Like we're actually missing a lot. And it's, I don't know, it's like, oh wow, that's a new idea. It's not.
We lost it.
Yeah, we've just cut off our body from our head and focused on one thing. Yeah. So there's some reflections.
So getting back to the question of, what do we do to balance, and like the answer kind of asceticism, does this question in some way, or would you see this question as assuming that there is a point of balance? So this is sort of like just a conceptual question, because if I think about an example where it's maybe really well defined, like in a lot of scientific areas, like we face like very well defined like trade-off situations where there is no optimum. You're developing a diagnostic test to tell if someone has a disease, and there's some chance it's going to tell people they have the disease and they don't, and some chance it's going to miss telling people they have disease and they do. You can't make a perfect test. You have to make things that either increase the chance of telling someone they have it when they don't, or trading off the other thing. And this is just kind of a fundamental thing when you're designing the test. Yeah. And I think of like this balance between the parts of the soul, or however we understand it. Like, should we look at it as in our own life we're looking for this point of balance, or that there might just be multiple places, like multiple practices we can, establish with things like prayer, giving, and fasting that will lead us in one direction and have benefits, but it'll have a trade-off. We're not going to have as much time in our life spent balancing this other part of the soul. And so life is fundamentally about leaning into one thing, losing a bit of the other, but that's just, we can't find the perfect point. You have to make a trade-off.
That gets into that's a great question. I think that gets into the deeper into the particular inherited wisdom of these traditions. And if you get into that, you'll kind of see there often are very specific answers to some of the questions within a particular tradition. There's a book that I've both recommended to both Zach and to Susan. It's called Unseen Warfare. It was actually originally written from the West, but then it came to the East later. So we kind of did this reverse thing. But a lot of it ends up being about ascetical practices. And it gets often very specific in many things, where it'll say this advice of like, okay, identify in your will what are your chief desires, or what the Greek word passions, pathos, the things that are making you passive, that these disordered desires, and figure out what the chief one is. You can't actually pay attention to all of them. So pick one, the one that comes up the most, the one that gives you the most trouble, and deal with that one. And then acquire whatever virtue is the opposite of that thing. And then you work on that, and it's like, as you do that, you're actually it'll kind of die down, and the other passion will come in. If someone suddenly comes, then deal with that one. And then once it goes down, go back to the thing that is your kind of chief one. And as you do it, you'll inherently, as you're dealing with it, you're going to need to lean more on your mind. And that will get your mind engaged in doing something, and that will help turn your mind. And you also lead in your heart of understanding, this is difficult, but that's also going to lead into like your heart in terms of establishing peace in your heart. And so I think all three parts end up, in that particular approach, end up getting involved. But they often will say there might be certain things they have, do these particular prayer rules, think about these things. But also, as you're going through life, be aware of these things that are going on in your will. So it gets to be very specific. And that's like a general book. Like that's like a general book that's written for anyone. If you get into the actual lived experience of someone who's lived it and done it, they might even give you even more specific advice of being like, talk to me about it. You talk to things like, okay, you should do this, you should do this, you should focus on this. Like that's the kind of level of detail that people can get to as far as really seeing enough people's souls to be like, you should do this, you should do this. It's something, I don't know, to me, in the Orthodox tradition, we call that being like a spiritual father or spiritual mother, where even with your own children, you learn to see enough things that you can like guide them. And I see that with my kids, right? My kid's doing math, and he does something, and I'm just like, you don't really understand estimation, because you're doing it the wrong way there. You don't really understand this thing. And I can see how he's working out, and I'm like, let me give you more of these problems, and I have to explain it, because I've seen what he's doing. And for me, having done enough math and been an engineer, I'm like, I know you're doing it. I know how you're thinking. You're doing it the wrong way. And so then I'll have to adjust that. But that comes from just a lot of lived wisdom of doing it. And you see that in parenting. How much more so when it comes to all these things of the soul, right? Of all these things that are there. I had very good conversations with Zach and Susan, where I've just maybe different things about life, about dating, about things, and I think both of them can attest. There's sometimes like I'll say something to them, and I'm like, I knew it before, but I didn't say it to them initially. But I was just kind of like, something comes up, they say something, they come to me, say, okay, like, you should look at this now, right? And that's just me from like being a parent, and me from like maybe say being in the same church they've been in, but like a little bit longer But what I'm saying is that there's people that are at a whole different level that have been and seen through a lot of ways, and it's really those people that are these people that are looked to as these saints, as these true Christos at the root of that meaning that can provide. And so that's what I would say is there are people will have very well defined answers to everything you just ask, but you kind of have to start being in a tradition to be able to see that. The other thing I'll throw out there too as well, there is a book by C.S. Lewis, who, again, he was an atheist, he later became Christian. So he talks about things in a very good way, because he's a 20th century person. And he's just so clear in how he writes. He has such a great command of English and the language and like the history and things like that at this like nexus of like the modern world. And he was thinking about Christianity, but I think it's applicable to other things too as well. What he said is he wrote this book called Mere Christianity that was trying to define the essence of what it means to be Christian. That could actually apply to like lots of different spiritual traditions, Eastern, Western, whatever. And what he says, he created this analogy of this like building with like a hallway and a set of rooms that are all like in this hallway. And what he said is like, what he's trying to define in this book is like mere Christianity, which is just, he's just trying to define the hallway. This is what is common places, common space entering into one of these places. And he's like, but then at the same time, he's like, but I don't want you to think that you should actually live in this hallway or live in this mere thing. It is actually in the rooms that one has the fireplace, the cushioning, the drapes, the couches. That is actually where you make your living in your home, in your dwelling place. That is where you have warmth. That's where you have community. That's where you have family. It's in the rooms. And what he says is like, this he's talking about Christianity in general, but I think it can be extendable to other things. He's like, the worst Christian tradition room, whatever you might think it might be, is still better than being in the hallway. In the long term. For some people, they might come in and they just came in and they've been there for a while, and some people might go in a room and stay there permanently. Some people might come and stay there for a while. But one should not camp out permanently in the room, because it's actually, or in the hallway, because it's actually in the rooms that one has the real life, real community, real connection, real warmth, that then is in that thing where you transform. And so what I would say is in any, and even if that one is, say, Orthodox, one has to pick one monastic tradition among them to be able to like have that experience. Whatever it is, this is what I feel like what I'm saying is applicable to anyone. And I feel like it's something that I think is applicable to anyone, is that regardless of where it is, you do have to reflect on where you are and realize there is some set of wisdom tradition that has influenced how you live your life. And become more aware of it. And you might need to like supplement that in some way if you haven't thought about it, like what's missing in it, and consider like what your options are. But you can't just. But what I would say to do that is like, don't assume that I'm going to stay doing exactly what I do and just like pick what I want. It's kind of like you have to really enter into a stream. And this is actually getting more romanticism. If you go to like what is his name? Harman, who did the idea that like he's a German guy. He's called like the Magi from like the north. And he talks about this idea. He's like this very he's very like philosophical guy. And he would just say, it's like, he kind of critique the Enlightenment of like, it's like they go to the river and they try to cut it off. They try to put everything in boxes, but the life is this living stream. and once you cut off, the stream dies, and you can't view it. And then there's later romanticists that were like, this idea of like, oh, language, where's language come from? Anytime I say a word, I didn't come up with that word. I am speaking into a stream that goes far before me and goes far after me. And when I say this word, and I'm German, and you are German, I'm saying this because these people have said it in German, and they've lived this in their German, and they've done this. And when I say it to you, you feel it as a German. And so there's a whole set of this way of how we now think about our attachment to ethnicity and like nationality comes from that romanticist idea of realizing there is a stream of life that's there. And when we are just in like the kind of enlightenment headway, it was like, let's just make everything is in boxes, everything like this. But like what the people who are Western, who weren't necessarily even Christian, you recognize like, no, there's this whole idea that there's this living stream that's there. And one has to like fully enter into that stream, rather than just say, I'm going to take some of the water out of the stream and bring it over here. That's not what it means to be in the stream. That's not what he was experiencing. And so that's what I say is like, one way or another, you have to kind of find the holistic understanding because, like I said, is like things can't necessarily be cut off. And I think even what you'll see is some of the times where like the example of the cheetah house with the meditative practice where people, and not everyone goes for that, but there are people that do. That's the whole thing of like, yeah, every monastic tradition, there is a dark night of the soul. There are, in the Orthodox tradition, there are people that, there's a guy more recent, he was a monastic, and after he like received this like euphoria and prayer, after that he had this like horrible attacks of like sexualized thoughts for like 8 years that like just destroyed his mind and was just like horrible. And it took him years of fighting, but after that he overcame it and he became even way more peaceful. But he was around leaders that would say, okay, this is what's happening to you. Here's how you deal with it. Here's okay. I'm not judging you. Here's what's kind of going on. This is what happens in life, and you can get through this. Mm-hmm. And that kind of guidance. But often if people are doing it and they don't have that guidance, and like whatever tradition, when you start really delving into things that are truly deep, that are truly powerful, there's just so much going on. And there just truly is invisible thoughts, patterns that come through them. That's just how it is. And you don't know what's all inside of you. You don't know what you're swimming in until you kind of really expose everything. And then you see, and things get laid bare. And so, yeah, I say all I have to say is like, it takes wisdom and it takes like tradition. And it takes like people that have been through it to be able to guide other people that are trying to get through it. Mm-hmm. And you're young, I'm young, I think, and stuff. It's like, I realize more and more, I'm like, oh, there's all these things that I didn't like know and realize. And you realize there's this wisdom that comes from ancients. I see that when I went back to like Nigeria and buried my my grandmother. I was like, man, and I saw how they did the funeral. I was like, man, like, there's a reason why it's done this way. And I'd never been here. And I'd never seen this. And you start realizing, oh, what else did I miss from this place? Because my parents immigrated and I never saw this kind of stuff. So it's just, I will go going on and on about things. But yeah, that's what I would say is just like, there's a little bit of a humility that I had to learn, getting older. You do enough things, you go to elite university, you think you figure it out, and then you get older, you have kids, you realize, oh, I can't change myself. Oh, I thought I could change my wife. Oh no, I can't change my wife. I thought my kids would be at this. No, they don't act like this. And you like realize, oh man, oh okay, this is where this was. This is where this way. Like this is why these practices are kind of there. And so I'm just trying to point out, like, and that's just like a fact of life. Like there's no way around it. It's there. And so one way or another, you kind of have to figure that out and find that tradition and that wisdom, and live in it because we all kind of need it. That's my appeal, really.
Yeah, I definitely think you need to put yourself somewhere and you need to move in some direction. I think often being somewhere is better than, like you said, being in the hallway. Use C.S. Lewis's example. I guess, yeah, if anything, to kind of set this at the end there, like it's understanding it as the reality seems like the important point, because it seems like no matter where you are in your life, down the road of kind of practicing harmony of the soul, yeah. Often the more in harmony you become, just the more sensitive to the remaining lack of harmony you become as well. And so I think it's often you see people just reflecting on, you always feel like you're not in harmony. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of making sense of that seems to me to be open to the fact that maybe there isn't a final point where it'll just feel harmony constantly, that you're always going to be getting closer to this, balancing point, but like trying to balance something on a needle. It's just constantly kind of falling one way, and you'll probably just spend your whole life, pushing it back and forth. And that's just the fate we're in. And I think we're trying to optimize something that doesn't have a single optimum point. You're just constantly, as life moves around, optimizing according to a couple different things. And I think the fact that we have these, like again, I like to bring it back to like nice quantifiable analogs that we happen to have in like the sciences, but we just have these cases where or use like an example in business, it's like, you can get someone you can make something for someone and you can make it cheap, you can make it fast, you can make it well.
Yeah.
You get to pick two, you know, and it's kind of like the joke is life, I think, is often going to be like that as well. You're
It is,
optimizing for a bunch of things and there's probably not a perfect balancing point. And that's why you always feel a little out of harmony.
Yeah. You make a lot of wise observations.
I also read C.S. Lewis, so I'm
Okay.
at some point probably quoting him.
Okay, gotcha. No, I think it's like the scientists, they know, they're more aware of what they don't know. Like when you get into something, you know your limitation. And yeah, 100%, if you start reading into these traditions, particularly the Orthodox tradition, it's like you come in and you think, oh, I'm totally fine, I don't do anything wrong, I haven't murdered anybody, I haven't done anything. And then you kind of start doing things and you're aware of, oh, what did I say to my wife? What did I do? Why did I do that thing? And you get deeper into that and you're like, why did I lose my attention? Why am I focused on that? Why do I worship that other thing? And you start going deeper and you start and I think it's not supposed to be a form of judgment. If one was to see all of that at the beginning, it would feel like judgment. It's like, oh, it's too much. But then once you start getting, you realize you both are more awareness, but also have more desire for entering into more of these things. And that's the spiritual life. That honestly is the spiritual life, is realizing that you never get there. That there's this infinite sense of what is perfect. And that we're all kind of slowly, to our abilities and to our time, slowly trying to work on it. And sometimes it's worked out over a generation. Sometimes it's not even individually we're able to get there. You know, I think about my grandfather, there was more polygamy in Nigeria, in his generation. So he had 3 wives, and it led to all this kind of dynamics in their family, and that they're still working out today. And I feel it really influenced how my dad thought about his relationship with his wife, and it really changed. And he kind of separated himself from how his dad did things. Even though he respected his dad or something like that, he chose to live a different way. And I think that so much because when I've gone through things in my marriage, my parents have been so solid and provided such advice, but I know that's only because there was this purification that happened over generations. Right? And then you hope, oh, maybe there's still more to grow that I can give to my own son in the future. And so, yeah, it is this thing of slowly kind of getting there over time, and as much as we are able to. You never perfectly fully optimize it, but it's this growth, and it's almost like the idea of having a tradition. You get to a certain point, and you see things like St. Anthony, 40 years, and he gets there, and then he has all this stuff, and he kind of starts handing it out to people. And I think that's the idea of what it means to be in a tradition, is you do a lot of those things, and you get to a certain point where for every reason you realize, okay, I've lived enough that I can really speak about this stuff and give wisdom, and now it's time to start handing it off to people. And so that's why we try not to lose too much, because it's been nurtured and handed out over generations.
I can just keep going with more questions. My next thought,
Yeah.
I'll actually ask this more generally. So
I'm gonna sit over here and more
yeah,
comfortable.
sure. So I'm not hiding behind each other. I'll ask this next one more generally. I'm interested in what people think. So I think this notion of being in harmony, how much do we trust our ability to self-assess how much we're in harmony? Because part of me is thinking, Book 1 of the Republic, you have this example of one of the antagonists, Thrasymachus, is basically arguing against Plato, and he's making a war against Socrates. And he says, this whole concern about living the just life, it seems like really the goal is to just, do evil and get away with it. That if you look at the people that are in power that were corrupt and bribe people to get to where they are, they're happy. If they're looking at their life, they feel great, they're doing well, and you're looking at this poor person who was honest and got taken advantage of and is suffering and hungry and struggling in life. It seems like the right thing to do is just do evil and get in charge and get in power and make the world do things the way you want. In the sense of kind of being the whole debate that Socrates has with this view is why is that person unjust? But I'm interested, for someone that maybe just does whatever they can to feel happy, and when they sit down and reflect, they look and they're just they're pleased with their life, they look forward to the day, they figured out how to not give in to vices, but generally they're not trying to practice the ascetic life. What do we make of their self-assessment that I feel happy, so I'm living life right? Is it possible that someone can be wrong in their self-assessment that they're living life right?
For the group, right?
Yeah, I'll ask it generally. I don't want us to just be going back and
yeah,
forth.
I can go back. Yeah, I can answer, but I'm willing to cede to anyone else that wants to respond.
Yeah, I think there's many different paths to living a good life. Asceticism is one part of one path. I mean, I know people who seem to be doing pretty well, who, you know, focus on that. Maybe they're just, I mean, I've actually had this issue of where I have a friend who I feel like he lives a very hedonistic life, and I don't know why it bothers me. It's like, let him do what makes him happy, and why is it bothering you? Because I grew up in a different type of mindset about how you should live your life. You gotta suffer a little.
But it's working out for them.
Presumably, I mean, I'm not having deep conversations
Yeah.
with this person because that's not what they like to do.
Going back to Unseen Warfare, I read a few chapters today. It's taking me a while to read it. I usually go through books a lot faster, but each chapter is really short.
Yeah.
It's very dense and very reflective.
Yeah.
But the beginning chapters is talking about self-reliance.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to people who are seeming to do really well, that rely on their intelligence, their physical abilities, and everything else. And that only goes so far, where you need to look at, and from something you said previously, it's you begin that self-awareness after you say something to your wife. And it's that self-awareness that you need to realize that you can't rely on yourself for happiness. And you go through these bad choices or these things that are, I guess, sinful, the things you say, the things you do, and then you need that self-awareness to realize, oh, that was wrong.
Yeah.
But you have to go through doing that wrong thing to realize that was wrong.
Yep.
That was my answer, I guess, is
What was the book you mentioned in the beginning?
Unseen Warfare.
Unseen
Unseen
Warfare.
Warfare, okay.
So it's like self-reliance does lead to happiness, but until you realize that you keep relying on yourself for your money, for your food, for whatever it is that you need, and it only goes so far until you realize happiness isn't what something I can do for myself. And then that goes towards more to the prayer, the giving, and the fasting, where it's not of more you're getting yourself, but things outside of the physical body, as in eating, or things outside of the physical body in terms of praying to the spirits and things that you can't see, and also to the giving, which is not something that you receive, but other people receive.
Yeah, I like that. Find that together. Yeah. Yeah, Unseen Warfare. It's a good good example of one particular summary, particularly of like Eastern Orthodox tradition of like how to navigate a lot of these. What do you actually do? And it's all about how to train those three parts of the soul. I want to say to your I think definitely people can poorly assess themselves. Like that, like we all can have blind spots. We all can be blind to things. So like that's like definitely clear to be the case. There's actually a psalm from the Bible that talks about this idea of there's the wicked man does not turn his eyes away from his own iniquity, so he does not turn and like hate it. This idea like we don't want to see what is like misformed in us, because it would like deal with our pride. Because we want to feel good about ourselves. We want to feel like we're kind of better, which I think is also one of the early things that the chapters of Unseen Warfare.
Yourself,
Right, and it's because we have this inflated view of ourselves. It's like egotism, right, or egoism. And so we often want to challenge that. And so that's definitely something that people need to be aware of. What I would say is there's a couple things to that. One, sometimes the people can actually be, in a temporal sense, like very kind of like happy, and that could very much be the case. Hedonism or whatever it may be. And I'm not here to necessarily judge a particular person. What I will bring up is Jesus had a parable in that Sermon on the Mount where he talks about this idea that there's a foolish and a wise man, and that the wise man built his house on a rock, and then the foolish man built his house on sand. And there's the idea that at some point, this foolish man, he built his house on the sand, and there's no foundation, and the wise man builds on a rock. And at some point, there's a storm. And the wind and like the waves come and the surf comes up and it like comes up onto like the kind of ground. And then the house on the rock, of course, stands up and the house on the sand collapses. And we're supposed to see the house as being a metaphor for our lives. And so what I think is fascinating about that parable is that regardless of how good a person is or why the person is about how they build their house, how they build their life, invariably storms come. Like, life happens. Like, things go on, and it eventually beats against the grounds of our house. And so what I say, in some cases, like, there are some cases where people actually literally are doing fine, but it's also like we live in a very like a little bit of a bubble here, particularly in America. We have the strongest, most powerful army in the world protecting us with the best weapon systems like ever. And we have this economic engine, we have this kind of growth. And I think sometimes we see a little glitch in the matrix, or like COVID happens and you run out of tissue paper. You're like, wait, I thought everything was always like it just means right there, but we're running out of it. So we like see these little glitches sometimes that like things aren't as like you don't realize how fragile it is. Like the Strait of Hormuz gets closed and you're like, I don't know, we're going to have that jet fuel in the summer, and like, you start realizing. And so there's a sense of kind of like we are speaking from a standpoint where like we have been so insulated from things. And like, if you look at history long enough, there's no way that's going to last forever. There's no way. Like, things are cyclical, economies are cyclical, things like that. And so there's a certain question of like, whether it's now, whether it's in generations, there's a certain sense of like the winds and the waves and the storms will come. Mm-hmm. And certain ways of life will be able to hold on, and certain ways of life will be much more difficult to make it through. So to some extent, it's a sense of kind of like, how can one be prepared for whatever life throws at you? Mm-hmm. There's a certain sense of that. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is what I've learned so much. One of my big lessons from being married and then having kids is like I'm now very fully convinced I don't really know people if I haven't like lived with them, if I haven't like lived in close proximity to them. Like I think I both about Zach and Susan, because I've known them close friends, but I actually haven't known them that long. I think I said this to her, like, look, I don't actually know your history, but I don't know everything about you. And I know from getting to know my wife, I'm like, now I feel like I understand my wife. And I was talking to sometimes Zach or like Susan, I'll explain how I understand what she's doing and why. And I was kind of like, now I understand this. But it took a lot of things, a lot of me messing up to realize this and to realize these lessons. And I was like, that's the same thing. It's like you like, I don't care who you're married, you could be as much in love or whatever, romanticism again there. And you don't really understand how the person is, and particularly you don't understand what all can happen in the world and when the rain and wind come, what they will do when that happens. Mm-hmm. What is the dynamic experience of being with that person? And so what I would say is like what I will say, if you pull me a particular example, I won't comment on it very much because I'm like, I don't know them. Mm-hmm. I haven't lived with them. So I don't really know what's going on in their soul. My wife, I see what's going on in her soul. Because like there's something she could try to hide from me, but she can't hide that too much, because it'll come out. Like one way or another. My kids, again, they're not so mature. Maybe when they're teenagers they can hide more things. Right now it just comes out. Right? So there's a certain sense of like, I guess I've learned more and more. It's like, yeah, like I think what I say is true is like I think one way or another, like things like the storms will come, and like that will, there's a sense of like the fire proves like what's true gold. What is fool's gold and what's purely gold, and so that's like the case. But even otherwise, kind of like I can't really even assess where they are right now very well unless I like really get to know them and stuff. And over time, like I don't know, wisdom is proved by her children, kind of a thing. You kind of have to see things kind of play out. So, and I'm also just not here to judge them. I don't feel it's my responsibility. In most cases, unless someone comes to me and they're like, I want you to help guide me, then like I don't see myself as being responsible to give them opinions about anything, pretty much. And if you're around me a lot, you'll see that. Like as much as I'm talking here, I think about the text. If like I've had some times where she's laughing because there's one time somebody came from another table and they were having some theological or debate, and this guy came over to me and he said, Ignatius, you need to come over here right now. I was like, why are you so urgent? And he's like, no, you need to talk to somebody. You mean you want me to argue with somebody? I was like, no, he said this, you do this. I was like, no, I don't do that. Like I don't try. If they want to come and ask, that's fine. But if I'm not gonna come and argue with someone about it, because they just maybe need to go through this. I'm not over that. Like they need to live their life, figure out. If they come to me, we can have a conversation. And I learned that from marriage. I learned that from other things. I learned that from like many things in life. That I realized like there's no point for a lot of things. Like, and that was me also moving from my head to my heart in many ways. Of like learning these kind of like lessons. Because you come in, I went to Stanford. I did like computer science, or I did electrical engineering. And I'm now around some people that I now like, oh man, we're so like in our heads all the time. And then you start realizing these things. You get into this situation, you're like, oh, I'm like underdeveloped in these like other parts here, and you realize it's there. So it's from going through all that I realized I don't know a lot of people here from a distance. You know, grass always weird. Everything looks perfect from far away. That's like a Postal Service song. I throw in random music quotes a lot, but yeah. So everything looks perfect from far away, but so no judgment. It's just kind of like it's only when you really live with someone that you really know what's going on in the soul, or if someone is like really purified that they can see from a distance. I'm not purified and like wise not to see from a distance that well. So I think you have to have a certain amount of reservation of judgment.
So like then applying, so like the idea, if I'm understanding, is like, if we look at the corrupt ruler that seems to have everything going well, it's like when political tides change and they're like it's threatened, like they're probably not going to be able to withstand that storm. Was like kind of your first point. Your second point is even when they're in power and things seem to be going well, if you're actually like in their inner court and like one of their trusted people, you might realize like they're constantly in fear of people betraying them, like all the political happenings going on. Like they might not actually be as happy as they seem looking on the outside.
100%. That's exactly summary what I. Yep. 100%.
Do we all raise our hands and sing?
Ron,
Yeah, we can skip late.
do you need to kick us out?
Thank you so much. This
No
is
problem.
great.
I love your questions. Thanks so much I love the engagement from all you all. Thank you all for coming and being engaged. It made it worth the time to put it together.
Thanks for
Thank
presenting.
you for being our guide.
We can come back in a later month and just give a history of hip hop or something.
Oh,
That would be
if
fascinating.
you want to. I have stuff. I already have stuff for that.
Alright, then you're ready to go.
Cool.
Do we want to sing happy birthday to the birthday boy?
Oh
Let's do it.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ron. Woo! Happy birthday to you.
You made it to 40.
Thank you. That was very nice. Now we have cake.
Let them eat cake.
And thank you, Zach.